This is a live, unscripted commentary of Dark Souls as it was back in 2011 on the PS3. This is the 1.0 unpatched North American version. As you can tell, you just saw the visuals glitch there for a minute. This is being played on the RPCS3 emulator rather than on original hardware. I do have this game on physical disc for the PlayStation 3. I'm not playing it because my capture card, unfortunately, can't capture footage from the PS3. The PS3 has some sort of copyright protection on video output footage, and without some sort of splitter or some weird capture card hardware, I can't capture footage from it. I'm going to put some footage here. I did a few years ago capture footage of Armored Core 4 Answer from the PlayStation 3 console, and I was going to make a video with that footage and it never came around to making it. So that was with an old, cheesy, like $20 capture card. I've since upgraded to a $150 one, and of course this one doesn't have whatever sort of drivers are needed to decrypt the signal coming out of the PS3. So I'm playing it on an emulator, and it's going to have some visual glitches here for a little bit, but I promise they will go away. They're not going to persist throughout this whole video. This is not going to cover my progression of the entire game. This is just going to be for the first 2 or 3 hours or so. I don't want to have some sort of long-running commentary for like a 10-hour playthrough, mostly because I'll run out of things to say by the 3 or 4 hour mark, and also I don't think it would be terribly interesting to watch an entire playthrough of Dark Souls, regardless of this being an older version, maybe not something that a lot of players might be used to these days with the remastered version. I did capture footage of Dark Souls Remastered. I have it on the Switch, and that captures just fine, and I'm going to put some footage here for comparison. Something that is immediately distinct is that Remastered is much brighter than the original game, and I've played the Remastered for so many years. This is my first time revisiting the original. I had forgotten just how dark it was. It really owes up to the name Dark Souls with how dark this game is, and this is just with the stock brightness settings. I didn't adjust it, although a little bit later on I do make the game a little bit brighter just because I don't think it would be enjoyable to have viewers watch something that's so insanely dark. It's difficult to make out the details, especially since YouTube already compresses the footage and makes it worse than the native resolution that I'm capturing at. So the purpose of this commentary is going to be to cover the game design of Dark Souls, both from a perspective of someone having played the game for 15 years, not every year for 15 years, on and off of course, but also I want to share some insights of how I played the game the first time as a newcomer to the series 15 years ago, back in 2011. I played this game on the 360, I didn't play it on the PS3 at launch because I didn't own a PS3 at the time, and I'd known of Demon Souls. I actually knew of Demon Souls from a review of Game Informer, and it caught my eye because that review was predominantly talking about the difficulty of the game and highlighting and praising the game because of its difficulty and how that's affected his playthrough. But the difficulty itself was not the allure to me. I think the reviewer mentioned something about taking 15 minutes to kill the dragon in the opening stage of Boletaria, and how he was chiseling away with it at arrows the whole time, and how he derived enjoyment from that experience. That doesn't really sound too enjoyable of an experience to me, just plinking away at an enormous health bar for a quarter of an hour with arrows, but it really stood out to me, both because I'd always been a lifelong fan of action RPGs, and here was an action RPG, and I couldn't play it because I didn't have a PlayStation 3, which is why when Dark Souls was announced to be multi-platform, I jumped on it right away. I was like, I need to be there. I'm getting this day one. I had a 360 because at the time all my friends had a 360, and so therefore I also had to get one. If we're going to play multiplayer games, we need to be on the same console. So that's why I had a 360, and I was able to enjoy Dark Souls at launch, which was a really nice surprise because the 360 wasn't really a powerhouse for JRPGs. It had a few. I'd played stuff like The Last Remnant and Infinite Undiscovery. Tri-Ace supported the console a great deal. They had Star Ocean 4, which I did not like, but I enjoyed Infinite Undiscovery, and Tales of Vesperia was also quite good. Of course, later on, I got the PS3 port, the definitive edition of that game. Before its release, this came out 3 weeks in Japan before it hit the North American shores. So I was trying to absorb every bit of information that I could at the time, largely through players that were playing the Japanese version, and the most prominent one was someone that went by the name of Epic Name Bro. I believe he still streams to this day. He didn't stream back then, he was making YouTube videos. And he was uploading his, I think it was his blind playthrough of the game, and sharing his discoveries with players from overseas, because he was playing the Japanese game, but all of his commentary was in English. And at the time, a lot of players were latching onto his videos as a sort of living vicariously through him enjoying the game before we got our hands on it. So when he found any discoveries, it's like, that's something that I'm going to apply when I played through the game. And what was really fascinating at the time was I don't know if he was the first person to discover, but he was how I learned about the Drake Sword, which I think he direct translated as Flying Dragon Sword, which you get from, of course, breaking the tail off the dragon, and he showed the strategy of chiseling away at it with arrows, which is reminiscent of that Game Informer review that I read. But what was fascinating about it was, when you looked at summon signs, so many players were wielding the Drake Sword, so it was very clear that a lot of newcomers to the game were all utilizing that same strategy and trying to get a powerful weapon early on to try to curtail some of that difficulty, because going into Dark Souls, everyone knew that this was going to be a challenging game, and it wasn't a surprise. Namco themselves leaned into that in the marketing. It was prepared to die. This was the game that was supposed to be the breakout from an era where a lot of games were tending more towards the easier side. Dark Souls was supposed to be the relief from that. And unfortunately, difficulty is something that's intrinsically linked with FromSoftware's name in general, and it's not really a subject that I find all that enthralling to talk about. I don't really think talking exclusively about the difficulty and how it affects the enjoyment of Dark Souls is a subject that I find fascinating, because it's so done to death. So many players, anytime they want to talk about Dark Souls, it almost always defaults to a discussion of difficulty and how that difficulty influences game design. I'm more interested in the game design part of that discussion rather than the difficulty, but unfortunately, anytime Dark Souls is brought up in discussion, difficulty is the de facto point of discussion, and I want to veer away from discussions of difficulty with this video, mainly because I'm sure you've already seen hundreds of videos talking about Dark Souls difficulty at length, and I don't want to be just another drop in the bucket. I want to set myself apart a little bit, and part of why I went out of my way to play this PS3 unpatched version is because I want to show a little bit of what this experience was like for an older player. And I'm not saying that I'm better than anyone because I played this game when it was new. There was over 1 million players that played this when it was new. It's not anything special to brag about. But at least with showing players with new videos about Dark Souls, I think a lot of people will default to showing the remastered version. And just for my own enjoyment, I make videos for myself just as much as for other people. I thought it would be more interesting to show the PS3 version. This opening part of Dark Souls is by far the most interesting part of its design. What I really appreciate most is that you're given guidance. You're told that you have 2 objectives, ring 2 bells, and you're given vague directions on where to go, but it's never explicitly said if the path you're taking is the correct one. This is the kind of approach to game design that I really appreciate, where you have an objective. You're not wandering around mindlessly. It's not something like the Saga series where they just say go and you figure things out just through natural exploration. You're given just enough to go on to figure out if the path you're taking is appropriate, but it's not so obvious as to hold your hand. And the more a game holds your hand, the less it feels like an adventure, the less you're really exploring the game, because if you know if the path you're taking is the correct one, you don't really have that moment where you feel like you're completely lost, which is something that is intrinsically linked to the adventure aspect. If you're on an adventure, you don't know if the path you're taking is the appropriate one. You don't know if this is the right way to go, and I like that sensation. I like being able to make that connection, like you can see here going to the graveyard. The first time I came to the graveyard, these enemies represented a massive difficulty spike from the asylum in the tutorial area. These enemies, they block a lot of hits, they have a ton of health, and they kill you in like 2 hits. And if you progress far enough through here to get to the catacombs, you'll see that they start to revive themselves. In my mind, I thought there's no way that this is the appropriate path. How can the difficulty spike be this extreme? And that's what made me decide this can't be the right path to take either. I made these connections through natural exploration. Well, if I can't kill these enemies because they're invulnerable to damage, talking about the ghosts in Yolanda Ruins, and if these enemies deal a ton of damage and they take a lot in return, what is the appropriate path to take? I turned the HUD on here, but you're going to notice that I played with the HUD off for most of this video. Mainly because I wanted to show off the world design in more detail, and I think the HUD detracts from that, not just in Dark Souls, but in most games in general. I really like having diegetic HUDs. I think Dead Space is the most famous example of this done well, with having the health bar be attached to Isaac's suit. I don't like having too much clutter on the screen. I think it really detracts from the beauty of the architecture of these worlds. But it also makes Dark Souls much more difficult to play when you don't know how much stamina you have left and how close an enemy is to dying. You may be a little bit more brave or reckless with your attacks if you know the next hit is going to be a guaranteed kill. But if I don't know how much health an enemy has left, it's much more difficult for me to play with that sort of aggression. I need to play a little bit more defensively. I don't know if I have enough stamina to roll after attacking. It makes the game a little bit more challenging than I would like. I don't really want this to be an extremely challenging experience. I already played this game at Soul Level 1, and it really wasn't too bad. But the difficulty is not why I wanted to play Dark Souls. It was for that sense of exploration. This is something that I've come to appreciate more with playing games. I want that explorative aspect. I want this to feel like a true adventure. And removing the HUD really helps with immersion. It's not a first-person game, so it's not going to be having that same level of immersion as you would get from those sorts of games. But it is absolutely a more enriching experience playing with the HUD off, and I recommend other players to take this approach. It takes some getting used to, and it certainly makes the game more difficult, not so much in this opening hour, but later on you're going to really start to feel that burn from not knowing how much stamina you have left. When I eventually decided to take this path to progress through the game, it made a lot more sense to me that this was the correct path to take because the enemies were being killed in much less hits. This had to have been the correct route. And it made sense because that NPC said there's a Bell of Awakening up above and this path leads upwards, so this had to have been the intended route. And that's something that you apply critical thinking through playing the game and making those determinations through your experience. And that feels more rewarding than just having an outright arrow or marker or maybe some sort of instruction listed on the screen like take the path leading up the cliff. When you're given those directions, it feels less like exploring and more like following instructions. You're doing as you're told. And I don't think there's something particularly wrong with doing what you're told. A lot of games take that approach to game design. But for something that's meant to be primarily exploration focused, which I think Dark Souls is trying to emphasize exploration above all else, not just literal environment exploration, but also through the weapons and armor that you equip, that sense of exploration would be diminished if your hand was being held a little bit too much with excessive guidance. So I'm very grateful that FromSoft respected the player's intelligence enough to let them make the determination if the path he's taking is appropriate based on the enemies that he's fighting. It may not be obvious from the footage being shown, but I've racked in quite a bit of time playing Dark Souls, not so much in recent years, more so when it was new. When this game was new, I played it to death. I played hundreds of hours. I've played over a dozen playthroughs. And I think I permanently burned myself out from being that invested in this game at the time. For a solid 2 years, Dark Souls was my go-to game, and I think even now, 15 years after its release, that sensation of being exhausted by this game never fully went away. I didn't play this recently. The last time I played this was 2 years ago. One of the first videos on my channel was a challenge run playing Dark Souls Soul Level 1, which is something I'd never done before. And that was the first time I'd played Dark Souls in several years, so I struggled with it a little bit. Not too bad, but 2 years after having played it last time, you can see that I'm incredibly rusty with the game, and I'm going to be struggling a little bit here, and maybe a little bit more so than usual because this original release of Dark Souls, I think is a little bit more challenging than the remastered version. I'll try to point out some of the differences as I approach them. But something that I had already missed was those ghosts in the New Londo ruins, they don't drop souls. I didn't kill any in this video, so I won't be able to prove it, but I did show another thing that I missed is that the skeletons in the graveyard, those also don't drop souls. That's when I turned the HUD back on. I'll share footage here. After killing those skeletons, I didn't receive any souls, so some enemies had the amount of souls that they reward the player adjusted through patches. And I don't know if 1.0 was available at launch. I think 1.01, I think there was a day one patch for this game. I don't know how many players played it unpatched, and it's certainly something that you wouldn't be doing nowadays unless you're trying to do what I do and relive what the experience was like 15 years ago for a YouTube video. Choosing a gift at the start of this game on the first playthrough was pretty interesting because there was one item that drew attention away from all the others, and I think that was something that should not have been incorporated as the starting gift, and that is the Master Key. When you look at something like the Master Key and you read its description, you realize, why would I choose any of these other items? A lot of them have vague descriptions, you don't know what kind of effects they have, if any, and some of them just look like the dime a dozen consumable items that you'll pick up through exploration anyhow. You may not realize that on a first playthrough going in blind, but you would at least be able to make the determination that the Master Key is an order of magnitude better than everything else. You have it in your mind, why would I not pick the key that opens every door? That seems like something that every player would want to pick, unless of course you pick the Thief class. But it doesn't really hit you that the Master Key may not be the Master Key that you think it is until you get into the game, and you realize that it's not opening every door. It's of course still extremely valuable, and I do pick it every single time. But it's not as overpowered as I originally thought. And you're going to see here I'm ambushed by way more skeletons than I expected. The reason for this is because there are, I think it's a pair of skeletons on the roof that throw firebombs. They jump down. I don't know if they've always jumped down. I don't remember it ever being this extreme. You see, like, I have this conga line of skeletons that I lured near the bonfire. I'm going to show footage of the remastered version. I was not fighting anywhere near this many skeletons. So in some sort of update, I don't know if it was just a patch for the PS3 version or if this was introduced in the remastered version, it's hard to say. But FromSoft adjusted the behavior of these enemies and they no longer jump down onto the bridge to fight you. I do think that was a wise difficulty modifier. This is a little bit excessive for a new player. I do remember dying here quite a bit when the game was new, so maybe they did jump down for at least a few patches when the game was new, but it of course has been adjusted since then, and I'll show you when I climb onto the roof here in a bit that those skeletons are no longer up there, so this room becomes a pretty dangerous death pit in this 1.0 version. A lot of the skeletons hide behind door frames and out of reach. You're going to see here, anyone that's played the game knows about this enemy tucked here in the corner. That is not really a fair enemy placement. And I think too many players view Dark Souls as a sort of fair difficulty, and that is not an opinion that I agree with. I don't think Dark Souls design is fair. And that is an approach that I think a lot of players use as justification for Dark Souls being difficult. But I don't think a lot of players that appreciate Dark Souls difficulty made the leap to other difficult games. And if their justification for Dark Souls being the difficult game that they play is only because of its perceived fairness, then that's not something that I can really get behind, because not only is Dark Souls unfair, especially with things like the Mimic Chest, and you can argue that, oh, it is fair because if you notice the chain, the Mimics have their chain, it's not that perfect curl, it's wavy. That's not something that's very easily determined on a blind playthrough. That's something that's noticed in retrospect. There's no way of knowing if that chain has a different orientation than the other chains, that this is a Mimic chest. You don't really feel compelled to hit this chest merely because its chain is different. In fact, looking at the chain may be something that you don't even notice. Like, I never noticed the chain the first time I played. Like, look at this chain. It's curled. That's not something that was very easily noticed. Of course, now it's something that's very obvious, but again, that's something that's noticed in retrospect, not so much first time playing through the game. And that's something where players view as justification Dark Souls is fair. It's fair if you know what to look for. And if that's the case, then every game is fair once you know what to expect. That was something that was also changed in later patches. These crystal bugs, their drops were automatically added to your inventory. They weren't something that needed to be picked up, which was a little bit of an annoyance in this unpatched version because you need to go out of your way to pick them up and they may be in a dangerous area. This is another thing. You see I take a hit there climbing that ladder. That skeleton's position was reoriented. He no longer ambushes you at the top of the ladder in the remastered version. So you can see there are little tiny adjustments to difficulty, but they add up. Another adjustment is the bosses. I believe they all drop a homeward bone, and they didn't in this original version, and the items. Any item you pick up for the first time is automatically added to the shortcut. That is another change. This was infuriating when the game was new. Was cycling through the items and you see the souls there and you don't want to have them in your shortcut. That's something that was changed in a patch. The day before this game came out, IGN did a 24-hour live stream, and I remember someone sent a message, "Don't kill this boss using the ladder trick." And of course, the person playing the game climbed the ladder and did this plunging attack to kill the boss. And I think the justification was, no, there are two ladder tricks. There's one where you can glitch the boss's AI by hanging onto the ladder, and there's using a plunging attack to drop his health bar by quite a bit. And the first time I played this game, the way that I killed this boss was just by repeatedly cheesing him by climbing the ladder, but of course you can see that is not at all the optimal way to go about killing him. Here's another change. I believe there is now a way of knowing how many souls you need to level up, whereas in this unpatched version, there was no way of knowing. So it was just spam as many souls as you need and hope that you have the required amount to reach the next level. You also couldn't consume multiple of the same soul at once, so you had to use them one at a time. Little tiny things like that made the game a little bit more cumbersome to play. But a game being more cumbersome doesn't necessarily make it worse. It's a tiny little detail having to use each soul one at a time, but it was also memorable. Why do I still remember this insignificant part of the game all these years later? When you struggle with a game or when you deal with annoyances, it creates these memories that stick with you. When everything is easy, when there's no resistance with the game, it's very difficult to make those connections. Having to contend with trial and error, that is what makes some of the most memorable parts of gaming for me. This was a farming spot back when I actually cared about farming for souls in this game. I would just repeatedly run up here, bait the dragon, have him breathe fire. I think you get about 1,000 souls. In fact, dealing with this dragon still is a pain in my ass 15 years later. It took a little bit of experimenting here, but I didn't realize that you just need to wait in this spot for about 15 seconds before the dragon finally decides to land on the bridge. You're gonna see I decide to peek my head out and I take some damage here. There it is. I eventually decide to just plant and wait, and the dragon drops down. The reason why I'm doing this is because I want to grab the claymore, of course. The two weapons that really defined the bulk of my playthroughs of Dark Souls 1 are the claymore and the Zweihander. I generally don't like using slow, heavy weapons in games, but for whatever reason I make the exception for Dark Souls 1. I typically don't like using magic in these games, and I can't really say why. I think the dynamics of combat are more interesting when you have a melee weapon, as opposed to just hanging back and lobbing spells. FromSoft, I don't think they ever implemented magic in a way that felt all that exciting to use, at least for my palate. Dragon's Dogma, which I believe came out a year after Dark Souls. A selling point for me for that game was the magic. The magic was much more interesting to use. It felt like it felt like you were more active in combat with magic. Whereas in Demon Souls and Dark Souls, magic just never really felt like an interesting playstyle for me. The variety, to an extent, is a reason to play this game, but it's not the sole reason. And in the same vein as the combat, I don't want to play this game just because I have all these options, and I don't want to play this game just because the combat is or isn't a certain way. I play this game because I like the progression of it. I like flowing from one area to the next. I like the resistance the enemies offer. I like gradually developing into a build. even if I play the same way every time, it's that experience of progression that I value. And I think that's something that Dark Souls has accomplished better than any other game in the From Software library, is that progression, especially in the first half of the game. It's a very smooth gradient. There's no absurd difficulty spike, there's no portions that feel like overt filler. Everything flows together very nicely. I suppose another reason why I gravitate towards strength builds here is because most of the dexterity weapons, at least the good ones, they take a little bit of effort to get. So getting something like the Baldur's Side Sword, which has a very low drop rate, that's not really an enticing experience. I don't want to grind these enemies for an hour, which sometimes it's taken me just to get their weapon to drop. I don't want to delve deep into the catacombs to get the Great Scythe. You can kill that merchant to get the Uchi Katana, but I don't like the low durability of that weapon. It's just, by picking a strength weapon, I don't have to contend with things like farming or having to repair my weapon after an hour of play. Those are things that impede the progression that the game works so hard to create. The first time playing this game, I got to this point probably at around the 6 or 7 hour mark. It had taken me quite a bit of time. It was a struggle. And you notice I only fought one boss. Even so, the bosses were not really the sticking point for me. It was getting past the enemy gauntlets and hearing that tink of the blacksmith hitting his hammer on the anvil. I thought that was a boss. Of course, I come down and I see the bonfire. This was a weight off my mind. This was a huge relief finding this thing. Finding bonfires on that initial playthrough was so immensely satisfying. This was your checkpoint. That's something that ties into a lot of the discussions of difficulty, is how it affects your playthrough. You wouldn't really have that same experience of relief by finding a bonfire if the game leaned towards the easy side. It's because it's difficult that finding something as minor as a checkpoint becomes a big deal. I make no claims about being a great player of Dark Souls, or any video game for that matter. I don't like to brag about my performance in games because I don't really take games so seriously to want to brag to other players about being good at them. I just like enjoying games for the sake of playing them, not because I want to be viewed a certain way. I don't really care if I'm viewed as a good or a great player, and for that reason, I'm gonna leave in a lot of my deaths from when I played this game. For one, it humanizes me, and it's also justification for that point that I made about video games being more for entertainment rather than being a statement of who I am, but also because I think some of these deaths will lead into more interesting discussions about enemy design. I want to show off the trees here leading up to Sen's Fortress. You'll notice that not only are the textures quite blurry, they are not fully 3D models. They are flat images that bisect each other to create the illusion of depth. And that's something that really you'll only notice if you stop to look. Just walking through this area without paying attention, you won't really notice that these are not 3D models. This was the case for foliage like trees and bushes for a lot of games back in the PS2 and PS1 era, and it never bothered me, and it still doesn't. I don't think a game is worse because it has poor visuals. In fact, most of the games that I play are still PS1 and PS2 games. I don't have that desire for games to reach photorealism. I value interesting art direction more than any attempts to make a game approach the fidelity of reality. The NPC interactions in Dark Souls were never all that interesting to me, mainly because it's difficult to find where they are, where they go after each world event without a guide. And that leads into that sense of exploration where not everything is spelled out right for you, and you're meant to find these secrets out, maybe not all in your first time playthrough, maybe on a subsequent run. Maybe, like back in the days when the internet wasn't popular, you would share secrets with your friends at school during lunch or on the playground. How did you get to this dungeon in Zelda? I don't know how to make it to the next dungeon. I don't know what item I'm missing. You share secrets with your friends. That's something that is very much lost with modern games. You don't really have that same level of interpersonal interaction with other players when you're stuck. If you're ever stuck, you just look up where to go on your phone. Before a game is out, there's already full walkthroughs on YouTube detailing the progression of a game. I think that detracts from the enjoyment of a lot of games, because now if I'm ever stuck, which oftentimes isn't the case because a lot of developers don't even want you to have that sensation of being lost to begin with. But even if that is something that happens, it's very easy to course correct because you can just look up where to go before a game is even out. And you can see here that my old man reflexes are kicking in. I didn't rush to get that crystal lizard. But that magic of discovery is something that is very difficult to replicate nowadays. You need to have some sort of self-control to not just have that urge to look up the answer online. I'm cheating a bit for this playthrough by getting the Grass Crest shield. I did not get this on my first playthrough. I valued shields with 100% physical stability rating more than having this stamina regeneration. I didn't value that part of the game. I didn't really place great emphasis on stamina regeneration because I didn't know how good it was. The degree to which you experiment is highest on that first time playthrough. And because I said that that's the part of the game that I value most, that's why I never really enjoyed Dark Souls that much on any of my subsequent runs. It was really just that first where that sense of magic was highest. And no matter how many FromSoft games I've played since then, I've yet to replicate that magical sensation of playing the game for the first time, and I don't know how much other players will relate. I made a post, and it seems like a few players have said that their first playthrough of Dark Souls was their least interesting one. It was only through experience and eventual mastery that they've come to appreciate these games. I roll in the opposite direction, where because I value that adventure aspect, because everything is new and fresh and mysterious on that first time run, and I don't know what works, that is the type of game design that I appreciate. That's what made that first playthrough so special. Knowing what I know now, a lot of that magic is lost. I knew to get the Grass Crest shield. I know the optimal route to play through the game. I know that I'm not going to get lost. So all of those sensations that made that first playthrough so memorable that I've relayed to you thus far, they're things that I can't replicate on subsequent runs. And to a small extent, I can try to replicate those when I play a new FromSoft game for the first time. Playing Elden Ring or Bloodborne for the first time, I do have those moments where I get lost and I'm stumbling trying to figure out what does or doesn't work, but never to the extent of that first time playing through Dark Souls. Fighting this enemy without a HUD is pretty difficult because not only do I not know how much stamina I have, and I need to know so I can be prepared to dodge his attacks, I also don't know how much damage I've sustained, so I may not be using optimal Estus healing here, and I think I run out before I die, I'm not sure. But yes, I do die against this enemy. He's not particularly difficult to fight, although on the first playthrough I don't know if I ever bothered fighting him. I just saw that this was a very large enemy with a huge health bar, and I just left him be. He didn't seem like anything compulsory that you needed to kill, so I didn't bother with him. I do like that these types of enemies exist where they're optional encounters, and especially this one, he's not particularly difficult to slip past. I think he's more designed to teach you that these types of encounters will be present in the game, and by putting him in a very big open room, it's meant to be a teaching experience. You're going to be finding these difficult enemies, they're going to be very difficult to kill, and you're going to want to find a way to slip past them. This first example that we're going to be presenting the player, it's going to be easy to slip past them, but it's going to get progressively more difficult, and you'll see that when you fight these Titanite demons in Anor Londo, they're confined in much smaller rooms, and so it's more difficult to slip past them. I really like being able to dodge enemy attacks just by moving around the world in 3D space. That's always been interesting to me, and that's part of the reason why I enjoy playing shmups. That's something that parrying has done away with a bit, and I've covered this subject in the past, especially in my Final Fantasy Type 0 video. I talk about the mechanics and function of parrying, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. But I don't parry in Dark Souls. I don't really enjoy fishing for enemy attacks in that way. I much prefer just using 3D space and maneuvering myself around the environment to avoid attacks. That's just my taste. I really like having this enemy here because it teaches you the value of fighting an enemy in the context of its environment. Because this enemy, you see he parried me here, I'm going to leave this death in. Because the enemy is in a tight environment, it's supposed to be a pain in the ass to fight this guy, and you're supposed to make the connection that this is not the optimal place to fight him. Not only does he have the high ground, you're also in a narrow corridor. You're meant to pull him out from there into an open environment, and you're given a lot of room to do that. Little tiny things like that, where just depending on the position of where you place the enemy, you can create an interesting and memorable encounter. That is part of the level design. The level design doesn't necessarily mean the architecture of the level. It's the level in the context of what you're doing in it. Specifically in the enemy encounters, where you place the enemies and which enemies you choose to place in each area has a profound effect on how you move through an environment. So this Balder Knight, he has a lot of plunging attacks. Because this is a narrow corridor, it suits his playstyle. With the Claymore holding it one-handed, it whacks into the wall a lot, so I need to consider using a different moveset, either through two-handing the Claymore and hitting him from above, or doing something like that, jump attacks. You can see I'm two-handing it here. It changes my approach to how I fight this enemy, just depending on the context of where I choose to fight him. If I don't have options like that with my moveset, if I'm using a different weapon, or let's say if I'm new to the game and I don't know that holding the weapon a different way influences the attack properties, I would pull him out to ground level and fight him in an open environment so I can hit him with horizontal slashes. This is actually something that FromSoft did, I think, a little bit better in a game that's older than Dark Souls. It goes by the name of Shadow Tower Abyss. In Shadow Tower Abyss, the right stick influences the attack properties of your weapon. So if you're fighting in a narrow corridor, you don't need to two-hand a weapon, you just choose the direction to move the stick, and that influences the direction that you swing your weapon. So I think in that game, the combat is far more interesting than the combat in Dark Souls. And it has to do with the control layout of that game, and I don't think enough developers really take into account how unique control styles can influence your progression of the game. A lot of players just want simplistic, sort of homogeneous controls that function the same across most games, but not only does that mean most games look and play the same, you have that legacy skill that transitions from one to the next, so you don't have that same sort of exploration and learning experience when you get accustomed to controls. I've played enough games on this channel where the controls were a point of worthy discussion because of how obnoxious they were, but I appreciate those obnoxious, difficult to get accustomed to controls because it makes each game feel different. It has that tactile feel. It may not look different, but take for example Monster Hunter. The original Monster Hunter on PS2, you compare that to something like Monster Hunter Freedom on the PSP. Similar though they may look, they play differently because Monster Hunter on the PS2 had you swing with the right stick to attack. So even though it's the same game, the controls give them a different feel, and that's something that doesn't really translate well to the passive activity of watching someone play a game. That's something that has to be experienced, and that's something that I really value about video games, is that tactile experience that you can only get from physically holding a controller in your hand. It's one thing to watch another player play a game, but it'll never replace having that user experience. For as popular as watching other players play a game has become with the advent of streaming and how widespread it's become, I don't think that it will ever replace the desire to play a game yourself. Maybe for games where the interactivity portion of it is minimized in favor of watching cutscenes, like movie games. Maybe in that sense it's more enjoyable to watch someone else play a game, but for something like Dark Souls, where the focus is entirely on the gameplay, that's something that can never be replicated by watching another player play the game. Very little of the playtime is spent watching things happen. Most of the activities that occur allow the player to retain control, usually for stuff like boss interactions, and that's a large contribution to the excellent pacing of the game, is the fact that you're always in control. You never feel like the pacing has been interrupted to show you a cutscene. Something that FromSoft has of course done better in Kingsfield 4, another game that I've played on this channel I think 2 years ago now. I've started to come around a little bit on Kingsfield 4. I think I was a little bit too harsh on that game when I first played it, and I think it's worth revisiting. Probably not to make a YouTube video, but just for my own self-satisfaction. Because one of the strongest parts of Kingsfield 4 is that it doesn't ever strip control away from the player's hand. Everything that happens in real time. The more games become more graphically advanced, the more developers want to show off those visuals by stripping control away from the player and forcibly showing them cutscenes or things like character interactions. They want to show off these assets in a deliberate fashion rather than it being an organic part of exploration. I at least admire Dark Souls and FromSoft in general for having that almost sort of old school intent with game design where they let the gameplay speak for itself. They don't want to bog down that progression too much by stripping control away from the player. Having the souls serve two purposes, both as experience and as a form of currency, is one of the defining hallmarks of Souls games and what people call Souls-like. I'm not particularly fond of that term, I just call them action RPGs, but that might be one of those things where the more a game resembles the mechanics and interactions of Dark Souls, the more inclined people are to label it a Souls-like. So if a game has stamina and having currency double as a form of experience, and if you drop it upon death, the more of those features that a game includes, the more inclined people are to label it as Souls-like, which is basically a derivative of the action RPG. But I appreciate the efficiency of combining experience with money. I think too many games go overboard with different types of currency, and it becomes cumbersome and unwieldy having to keep track of 4 or 5 different types of currency. I think it's unnecessary. What Dark Souls does is it presents an opportunity cost. Every purchase you make is also forsaking an opportunity to level up. Those moments of opportunity cost are examples of true player choice, where you have to give something up and get something else in return. Having that cost that you have to pay makes each decision feel more impactful. Making a decision and having no repercussions behind it is not really a decision. And what a lot of these games that try to copy Dark Souls do, and this is even present in later FromSoft releases, is they afford you the ability to reset stat points. If you can reset your stat points at will, you lose that opportunity cost, you lose that feeling of permanency. It doesn't so much feel like a build, so much as it feels like an option, and you can always just change your option later on. I turned the HUD back on for this boss fight, and I think I leave it on for the remainder of this video, because I didn't want to be stuck on these bosses. I didn't want it to impede my progression. It was more for the efficiency of making a video than it was for my own enjoyment. But if anybody is looking to play Dark Souls with a fresh approach, if you haven't already tried, give it a playthrough with the HUD disabled. I think it'll give you a better appreciation for the art direction of the environments, and it also injects some more challenge into the game, where you need to make better judgment calls on how much stamina to expend, because if you can't see the bar, you don't know how much you have left, and you also need to make more intuitive judgment calls on when to use Estus flasks. On the subject of Estus flasks, I think I kindled most bonfires on my original playthrough to get as many Estus flasks as possible, because I needed them to learn these boss fights. I didn't know their patterns, and being able to have more mistakes forgiven by having access to more healing is very important during that learning process. But I haven't kindled the bonfires in many years, and I think FromSoft hasn't really given enough incentive to engage with that part of the game, at least for Dark Souls, where you revert to human form and then kindle the bonfires. I wish they did more interesting things with that mechanic. Instead, it's entirely used as a crutch. You revert to humanity to summon other players for help, and you kindle bonfires to have access to more Estus flasks. It's all things that help curb the difficulty, but that's really about where it starts and ends. It doesn't go beyond that. It doesn't affect the world in interesting ways. I know a lot of players slam Dark Souls too, myself included, but the one thing that I think it does a little bit more interesting than Dark Souls is with the bonfire aesthetics. It's a way to bring the difficulty of earlier portions of the world up a little bit if you want to raise the challenge. I think Dark Souls would benefit from world scaling if it was implemented maybe in a similar way to something like the Saga series or The Last Remnant. In those games, the more powerful a player becomes, the more the world levels up to catch up with the player to maintain a consistent level of challenge. Dark Souls, unfortunately, does not level up with the player. If you go back to prior areas with a leveled up character or with better gear, you can destroy the enemies with little to no resistance, and you can pick up any items you missed without any challenge. I really like when games, they punish the player if they choose to go back to older areas with an increased level of firepower. Even something like Final Fantasy X, what the international version did was it introduced Dark Aeons. What the Dark Aeons do is their level is tuned so high that it almost encourages you to approach them with endgame level gear and stats. Even something like a JRPG that's viewed as really easy like Final Fantasy X, it does have some sort of repercussion for leaving an older area and wanting to revisit it. It's a form of world scaling. I wish From Software games incorporated that, and what Dark Souls 2 does is it leaves that choice up to the player with the bonfire aesthetics. You can level up each portion of the world. This is another very evident difficulty spike here, not just because of the status effects that these enemies inflict, but because it's very dark down here and it's very easy to be ambushed by these enemies. You can see that I lure them up here one by one, more of that technique that was learned in the Undead Parish when fighting the Baldur Knight. That's a part of game design where a skill that you learn earlier on can be applied later in the game. This way, in a bit of a reverse order, instead of luring an enemy out of a narrow pathway into an open area, I'm funneling a bunch of enemies into a narrow area so I can deal with them one at a time. That's something that you teach yourself rather than the game teaching you. That's why I'm not really a fan of tutorials, because tutorials outline these strategies, and that's something that's kept in the back of your mind as you play through a game. Without tutorials, you need to make these connections on your own. It feels more rewarding when you make those connections. Back to that trial and error part of playing video games. How is a player expected to become better at a game if the game is holding his hand every step of the way? What gives life meaning are these interactions where you learn through failure. That victory has meaning because you understood what it took to reach that victory. If you have hints, or if the game gives you assistance, or if you use generative AI to reach the solution, you don't really understand how you reached that solution. But a lot of players don't really care about the learning process, they just want to have the satisfaction that comes from achieving victory. But not only is that satisfaction diminished if you cheat your way towards it, I'd argue that the satisfaction is not even the point of the game. I can enjoy playing a game without beating it if the progression is entertaining. I don't have that desire to beat a game for every single game I play, and that doesn't mean I didn't enjoy my time with it, it's just that I've been satiated with what the progression, with what the adventure has offered me. Rarely am I inclined to beat a game just for the sake of beating it. Again, tying to the concept of fairness, I don't think it's particularly fair to place an enemy in a blind spot like that. For something to be considered as fair, there needs to be a level of anticipation. You need to know in advance what to expect. I think From Software understands this, and not every single enemy encounter can be viewed as fair. In the original incarnation of Dark Souls, Curse stacked 3 times. It would halve your health, then quarter it, then cut it to an eighth, basically putting you in one-hit kill mode. And curing the curse was an ordeal. I think the game suggested going to New Londo Ruins to have that NPC cure the curse, and I believe if you climb the Undead Parish, the NPC up there sells purging stones as well. But I sort through this inventory real quick to show that this NPC is not selling purging stones. So when you got cursed in the original release, it became quite the ordeal to cure it, and it was your predominant objective if you got cursed to cure it as soon as humanly possible. The game is challenging enough already, you don't want to compound it with even more challenge. This created an interesting adventure. Curing the curse, that was now your goal of the game. It was no longer ringing the bell of awakening or progressing through the game's intended path. It was going out of your way to cure this permanent ailment. This led way to a very famous strategy of going back to the tutorial area and trading, I forgot what item it is, with the Crow NPC to get 2 Purging Stones. And of course, that opened up a new comment, which was you can go back to the tutorial area. How do you do so? There's no obvious path. I flew into Firelink Shrine, and a lot of the guides at the time were designed to show players, did you know you can go back to the starting area? Here's how. And you would go, why would I want to go back to that starting area? And of course, there are 3 major reasons to go back there. I won't get into it in this video because this isn't intended to be a guide, but what I wanted to highlight was that journey part was only possible because of this malignant ailment that would not go away. It was permanent. It lingered. I died to Capra Demon here. I will forever maintain that this is the worst boss in Dark Souls 1, worse than the Bed of Chaos. And it highlights my problem with FromSoftware's boss design in that they create difficulty in very mean-spirited ways. I'm sure players have devised consistent strategies to beating it, but a lot of your success comes from climbing that staircase, and unfortunately, the dogs can impede your progress, and I'm going to show a couple of my deaths here, where my attempts to climb that ladder were fruitless because the dogs would not get out of the way, and of course I could run into a corner to bait the dogs out of the path and then try to climb the staircase then, but you also have to contend with this being a very cramped room. There's no reason for there to be 3 enemies in such a tight, clustered location. It is a way to create a challenging scenario, of course, but it's also not really a level of challenge that I find entertaining. I'm going to show another death here. A lot of my deaths the first time playing this game came from retreating to get my souls before they were permanently lost, and that's not really something that should be a consideration because of scenarios like this where coming back to grab those souls resulted in my death. I could have made a run for that staircase and continued the boss fight and picked up the souls later, but my urge to grab those souls before it's too late, my greed, was what resulted in my death there. So I can't be too upset for getting killed in that situation. Accessibility is a subject that I frequently bring up in my videos, and looking at this game with the HUD on, having played for about an hour with the HUD off, made me realize that accessibility doesn't necessarily need to entail things that make the game easier. It can be things that make the game better suited for what a player is looking to get out of it. So for example, I wish the HUD was more modular. I want to have the health bar and the stamina bar, but I could do without the souls in the bottom right corner, the enormous amount of space that all of my items and equipment are taking in the bottom left, the health bar for the boss on the bottom. I could do without those, so long as I can see the stamina bar and the lock-on reticle. That would be good enough for me. I would like to be able to see more of the screen without having it being taken up by these pieces of information that I don't feel are terribly relevant after you play the game for hundreds of hours. By switching over to predominantly PC these days for playing games, I've come to appreciate how much effort modders put to enriching these experiences by creating features and conveniences that the developers don't consider. And I really admire the players that do this for free, for no attention. They do it just because they created an experience that they wanted to get out of the game, and they wanted to share that experience with the rest of the world. I'm sure I could find a mod out there that makes the HUD modular for Dark Souls, and creates the type of HUD that would make the game more immersive for my taste. It's just a shame that FromSoftware doesn't have that inclination to make the game accessible for players like me that don't really want all of this extraneous information cluttering all of the effort that went into creating a really beautiful world. You can see that the camera is not really implemented in a great fashion here. It doesn't make parts of the environment translucent. It instead just minimizes the gap between you and the wall. You can see right there as I was climbing the staircase that it zooms in, and that makes it very difficult to judge the distance between you and the enemy in 3D space. And it makes for an experience that's not really all that enjoyable. It feels like oftentimes you got hit, and it wasn't necessarily your fault. In first-person games, it's very easy to maneuver the camera on whatever object you want at all times, but with something like Dark Souls, I think a lot of players play unlocked specifically because it makes the camera a little bit more consistent. But you can see the environment occludes the action. These trees, they really shouldn't be there, because as the camera swings around, it can obfuscate the boss's location on the screen like it did right there. It's very difficult to determine what action the boss is gonna take, especially with a game that's all about reading the enemy's behaviors and responding in kind. How am I to judge what action an enemy is gonna perform if the camera is erratic and if parts of the environment block the action? Like in that situation, I could not tell what the Capra Demon was doing. I suppose the solution would be to not climb the staircase at all and just stay on ground level, but then why even have the staircase there to begin with? I'd argue that FromSoft deliberately wanted you to use the staircase to control the AI pathing of this boss. I'm not opposed to fighting a boss in a cramped room like this, and I do think that the staircase provides a more interesting environment to tackle the boss. It's more so that this is not an entertaining boss to fight in this room. It's just much too big, and its attacks cover way too much ground. There's not a whole lot of room to create a safe distance between you and the enemy. And for an early game boss, I think it's a little bit too much. The difficulty eases considerably past this point, to the point where if you can beat Capra Demon without assistance, I think it's very likely that you can beat the rest of the game without too much issue, and maybe in that sense it's a good boss to put there. I think it's important to challenge the player early on to set their expectations, because if you're the type of player that can persevere and beat Capra Demon, you can beat Dark Souls by yourself. It's not necessarily going to be an easily earned victory, but I'm pretty confident that if a player can tough through such an obnoxious boss early on, he has what it takes to beat the rest of the game. In that sense, I do think that it is a good boss. It's just more so that it's not a fun environment to fight that enemy because of the way that the camera works. Even though I raised the brightness 2 notches above the default setting, the depths are incredibly dark in the PS3 version of Dark Souls, and I hope it's not too difficult to see when this is eventually uploaded to YouTube, because YouTube will compress the quality of this footage quite a bit and introduce some artifacting. But these remastered games, I think a number of them, the only thing remastered about them is the brightness. They tend to pump up the brightness levels to such a large extent that it reveals parts of the environment that were never meant to be revealed. A lot of this was meant to be hidden in shadow, not just atmospherically, but also to hide treasures or to hide enemies. And that in turn influences how you play through the game. You play a lot more carefully when you can't see what's 10 feet in front of you. If you can see everything everywhere, if your vision range is 50 feet, that influences your confidence in maneuvering through an environment. In the same sense, I don't really like remastered music tracks that cut back on dynamic range. Some tracks were meant to be quieter. Some instruments were meant to be softer. They weren't meant to be brought up to the same level as the lead instruments. I understand some listeners want to hear certain instruments like bass with a little bit more prominence, but they don't really consider what that does to the piece as a whole. Some songs sound different when quieter instruments like bass are raised up in volume. The eternal audiophile debate is that vinyl is the superior format, but I don't think that's necessarily the case on a physical level. I don't like vinyl for what it physically offers. I like the mastering of certain vinyl tracks more than what has been happening with digital conversions of these songs. And that's something that I think a lot of people don't understand about audiophiles, is they seem to think that audiophiles prefer vinyl because of some sort of preconceived notion of vinyl being a superior format. I don't harbor that viewpoint, and maybe some audiophiles do, and I don't necessarily consider myself an audiophile, but I do have a great appreciation for music, and certain albums, I do prefer listening to the original vinyl cut, ripped to MP3 of course, or some sort of lossless format if possible. Not because I think vinyl is better than anything else, but because the mastering of that original pressing is more pleasing to my ears than some of the remastered versions. I think the same case can be made for video games, where remastered versions are oftentimes the replacement for the original, in the sense that you can't buy the original version of these games a lot of the times. The only version that's being sold on digital storefronts are these remastered versions. I don't know if you can buy the original PC release of Dark Souls anymore. You probably can. But it's very clear that if you were to ask the general populace which version should I get, I think a lot of them would recommend the remastered version, specifically because it comes with the DLC and a lot of people prefer it. But I do think that the remastered version is good enough, but there's something to be said about the crushing darkness levels of this original PS3 version that the remastered version takes away from that atmospheric quality just a little bit. And I'm sure some players will say, just turn down the brightness, but it's not really a one-to-one easy answer like that. Of course, things like mods can reshade the game to bring it more in line with the original vision, but as far as having an easygoing out-of-the-box experience, it's worth it to emulate this game. The RPCS3 emulator has come a long way. I think it's very easy to emulate these PS3 games. Not that there's many quality PS3 games to emulate in the first place, but I'm grateful that I'm able to capture this PS3 version of Dark Souls. At this point, I was thinking that the depths weren't as bad as I remembered as I made my way to fight the Gaping Dragon, but at some point I turned around because I remembered that you need to fight the Channeler, otherwise the boss gets, I think it's a 40% damage buff. And that takes you to the part of the depths that I find least interesting to go through, having to contend with those basilisks and the rats, and it's certainly because of how dark it is. It's more challenging than usual. I fell down some of the pits that lead you towards those basilisks, and I was hoping that I wouldn't make that flub in this video, but I'm gonna leave that mistake in just because, again, it humanizes me. I'm not a perfect person. I'm not a perfect player. I want to show these mistakes because it's a natural part of playing video games. People make mistakes. I cut out some of them, but those imperfections lead to more memorable experiences, at least for me. I was never the type of person that pursued perfection in anything I do. And I think having that perfectionist attitude is a one-way ticket to dissatisfaction in life. I fell down the pit. Is it here? No, it must be later. Having that perfectionist attitude, I'm glad I learned this lesson early on. It's a way to make sure that you don't get a whole lot of satisfaction out of life. Perfection is, I don't know if it's unattainable, but I've never attained perfection. I've never sought perfection because perfection is boring. I don't want the easy solution to everything. I don't want to know that everything that I'm doing is correct. I want to make mistakes, and I like when other people criticize me and point out my flaws because it helps make me a better person. I can learn how to better improve myself. For all the effort that goes into perfecting something, people will still find issue with it, and that'll just lead to me feeling dissatisfied. I put in all this effort into making something, and people don't like it, but why did I spend all that time arguing over the little minutia of how something is edited or how I play it a certain way? And players are going to find issues with it anyway. So instead, I just do what I consider to be satisfactory and I put it out there. There's always going to be another video to make. There's always going to be another game to play. And even outside of playing games and making videos, that's a philosophy that I apply to everything in life. I do something until I reach a level of satisfaction that I'm happy with, and then I move on. There's always something else to do in life. And having that approach of always looking forward to doing new things is what keeps me going. That's my drive for living. That's why I like living. It's because I'm always learning new experiences. The game doesn't have too many of these enemies that are resistant to physical attacks, and that's probably for the best, because if there were a lot of enemies like these slimes that are susceptible to magic above any other type of damage, it would encourage players to spec into magic for all of their builds. Oh, there's the pit. I try to panic and use a homeward bone here, but it takes a while before I see I messed up there. That's tripped me up so many times. I'm glad I remembered this before I forgot. The channeler buffing the Gaping Dragon, in retrospect, is a pretty fun little callback to Demon Souls with the boss of 3-1 Tower of Latria. You want to kill that NPC that will revive the boss of that area, and that's something that you learn if you fight the boss for the first time without killing that enemy. You can look up there and go, what is that? How did that guy revive this enemy? And then if you die to the boss, you're meant to make that connection that I need to kill that NPC, I need to find him. That way I can fight this boss without having to worry about him resurrecting her. I think this channeler buffing the Gaping Dragon, it draws a pretty similar parallel to that situation. It's not exact, it doesn't revive the Gaping Dragon, but it does buff it substantially. Like I said, I think it's a 40% damage increase. I don't like the Gaping Dragon because you can just employ the same strategy over and over again, and for how much health it has, it's not a particularly engaging fight. You just bait out the same attack, run around, and it just stays open for way too long. I don't really like that dissonance between having this very large, imposing, deadly-looking enemy that's extremely easy to kill. But it's an interesting contrast compared to Capra Demon, which is comparatively smaller, but deals a lot more damage and is much more difficult to fight. But this highlights the benefit of having this large arena. Because you have all this freedom to move around, it's very easy to dodge this boss's attacks. So on one level, I do appreciate the level design for this boss fight because it does take advantage of all this space. The boss charges across the room and you have plenty of room to move around it. It also jumps and you're given plenty of room to look up to guide where its trajectory is going to be when it lands. It also spits out area of effect attacks. I think it damages your equipment durability, and you're given plenty of room to run away from it to avoid the attack. So by having this large arena, at least it's not wasted. It's one thing to have a large arena and a tiny enemy that doesn't make use of it. That's not really an interesting use of level design. At least in this case, large enemy, large arena, and you're given plenty of room to keep track of it. So in that sense, I do think it's a better designed fight. The issue that I have with it is that it's just very repetitive. This is one of those things where challenge would not make this a better boss fight. This is something that Demon Souls did a fair bit better than any of the Souls games that came out after it, where each boss was meant to provide a unique gameplay experience. Gaping Dragon does not provide a unique combat experience in any fashion. It's not an uninteresting fight because it's easy, it's an uninteresting fight because mechanically it doesn't do anything that the other boss fights don't already do, but better. Repeatedly running around behind the boss to attack its tail is not really an interesting strategy that you employ because you do it the same way every time and you're relatively safe back here. He doesn't always use the tail swipe, it's very rare. Most of the time he'll just follow the same loop where he jumps and then does this attack where he slams down and charges across the room. If FromSoft were to ever remake this game, I'm sure they would just make this boss faster and add more attacks in its arsenal. But it still wouldn't make it a more interesting fight, it would just make it more challenging. And maybe for some players, that challenge is interesting, but it's still a long ways away from their design philosophy of making something like Demon Souls. I don't want to be the type of person that praises Demon Souls because it's the first one, and because when it came out, comparatively few people knew about it and played it. And I'm not gonna lie and tell you that I played Demon Souls at launch, because I didn't. I didn't own a PS3 back then. I didn't play Demon Souls until 2 years after Dark Souls came out. And I appreciated it about on the same level as Dark Souls. It wasn't until viewed in the context of the rest of the series years later, after FromSoft made games since then, like Dark Souls 2 and Bloodborne, that I came to appreciate what Demon Souls did as more unique than any of its sequels and spiritual successors. And for that reason alone, I think it's going to stand the test of time as the more interesting game to play. So this video originally ended after killing the Gaping Dragon, but as I was editing it, I wasn't really satisfied with the progress of the video, so I decided to play a bit more. I'm recording some more post-commentary here. I want to give you guys a little bit of insight as to my process of making videos, because my original concept for this, I originally wrote a bullet point list. It took up about 3 pages in a Word document, and I recorded about 45 minutes of audio that was just going purely from memory about my experience playing Dark Souls back in 2011 and how I could never replicate that same playthrough again today. But after I recorded all of that audio, I thought, this is a pretty bad video. I trash a lot of my videos and you guys don't know about it, but that's part of the creative process. So even if I put out a video that's crappy, just understand that that crappy video is the best I've got. There are ones that are way worse than that, that'll never see the light of day. I just trash them. But I'm glad that I played a little bit more. This next session I played up until halfway through Anne Orlando, and I have a couple of different parts of game design that I want to talk about along the way. The first of which is combing through this upper part of Blighttown, which I'm a little bit unfamiliar with. You'll see as I try to navigate my way through this place. And notice again how pitch black this is. At some point I bumped the brightness up to maximum and you can't even tell. It doesn't help at all. And it really highlights how important these flames, these little torches that light your way, you really come to rely on those in this original version because of how crushingly dark it is. I'm sure if I played on an OLED display, it would be even darker. That faint, like grayish glow of the LCD monitor makes it a little bit brighter than it otherwise would be if I played on like an OLED display. Again, just moving past a lot of these enemies, something that you become familiar with. Like I said earlier in the Undead Parish, when you run past that Titanite demon, you've already been conditioned to run past some of the more larger obnoxious enemies, and they give you a lot of room here. But of course, look at the consequence. Now I've got 10 guys on my ass and this rotating bridge trying to make my way through it. I actually get past this first part without dying. It's not until I reach the bonfire checkpoint where things start to become catastrophic. Oh! I was just about to eat my words there, but I did survive that fall. The frame rate is going to get really bad. You saw a little bit of it just now, but it tanks to probably... I don't have any way to measure it, but it's probably 10 frames per second. You can see what I was talking about a minute ago with only being able to see the torches. That becomes a very important part of navigating. That's your primary navigation tool, is heading towards those torches. But it can oftentimes trip you up because it looks like a torch is on equal level with you, and as you head towards it, there's a giant pit in the way. So you really need to move very deliberately in this area. And it's an issue that would make for an interesting challenge, but what makes it obnoxious is the unstable frame rate. And it really is the unstableness of it that gets to me, because if it was consistently low, like if it just was a consistent flat 15 frames per second, if it was just hard locked there, that wouldn't be an issue. But it's the fact that it's variable and it flips between like 10 frames and 25 frames, that constantly see how it improves there. So I have to wonder if maybe just constantly orienting the camera to look down at the ground to minimize the frame rate disruption would be the way to go. But then of course, you can see where the pits are, but you can't see where the enemies are if you're constantly looking down. You can see that I'm funneling the enemies away from their spawn point. This is a pretty good part of level design where if you choose to fight the enemies where they spawn, you've got those narrow paths, and to your right you've got that abyss where if you try to roll, you'll fall to your death. But they put this torch in an area with a little bit more room to maneuver around, so it's a good spot to lure the enemies to deal with them. If they put the torch on the bridge, or if they put it in a more narrow pathway, it would be more difficult to fight the enemies, so it's a very deliberate spot to put the torch here. The saving grace with these enemies that they've placed here is they're not armored, so they take hit stun from most of your attacks, especially when I use the claymore here. Every single attack will hit stun them, so it just becomes a measure of having enough stamina to kill them with one combo. If these were armored enemies, they would be even more obnoxious to fight, but because they stagger so easily, they wind up being, even though they have a fair amount of health, or it's mainly just that I have a low upgraded weapon. I think my claymore is only +3 at this point. So I'm a little bit, not underleveled, but under-equipped for this part. But because they stagger so easily, they wind up being not too difficult to contend with. So you see here, even though the torch is highlighting where to go because it's placed by the ladder, it still illuminates a fair chunk of this upper part of the platform. and I've got enough room to juggle about 2 enemies at once. Most of the difficulty of Dark Souls, and a lot of FromSoftware's games, I don't want to say all of them, because I think starting with Bloodborne they've taken a deliberate change to prevent this type of gameplay, but at least in Demon Souls and the first 2 Dark Souls, going slow and steady and letting the enemies come to you, baiting them out, and luring them into open areas is a strategy that works for not every encounter, but for most of the game. It'll get you through it just fine. These games, they really teach you the importance of patience, because when you go slow and observe the different details of your environment, and you lure enemies towards you rather than rushing headfirst into danger, that curbs a little bit of the difficulty, not all of it. But especially for Blighttown, if you're patient, a lot of the difficulty starts to evaporate. So I'm sure a lot of players that are intimately familiar with this game will be wondering, why am I throwing fireballs at this enemy? What is the purpose of this? I'm not going to kill him. But my simple explanation is, I haven't been through this portion of the game in many years, and I didn't know that I couldn't kill him from here. So here comes a little mini saga of watching me repeatedly die to this enemy. Although this first time, I think this is a bit of an unfair death. I don't want to say unfair, but he flings me off the platform. Is it right here? His little claw. It's not even that I take... There it is. It's not even that I take an immense amount of damage. It's that one mistake, it essentially becomes a one-hit kill. It's very punishing. And having this degree of punishment where one failure equals death regardless of your health bar, that's a type of game design that really isn't all that common in games. If a game has a health bar, they don't want to put in a lot of instant death pits. I know a lot of games, if you fall into a pit, you'll just be lifted back up to the nearest platform from wherever you fell, and maybe you'll take a little bit of a health point penalty, but it won't be an instant death. Dark Souls is a little bit more merciless in that regard, in that if you fall, it's very punishing because it's just a death. That fall there is very interesting. I like that bit of level design because you see that glowing corpse down below, and that indicates a safe spot to fall. Even if you can't see the solid ground below, you see another example here. But this one is a little bit designed to trick you because it's right at the edge of a cliff, and if you choose to go a little bit too far forward, you'll die. So it does play with expectations a bit here. You have some parts where the glowing objects are designed to help you and lead your way, but some of them are just dead ends and some of them are traps. So it's not something that you can consistently rely on, and I like that the game toys with your expectations in that regard. That's something that helps keep level design interesting, is that unpredictable nature. When you expect something to be consistent in terms of how to maneuver through an environment, it takes away from that surprise element. And even here you can see that my souls are there, but it was in a pitch black area. I didn't know if there was any safe ground to get there. Trying to roll past this guy leads to my death. So I think a normal person would understand, don't go this way, but I'm not a normal person, so I'm gonna do this one more time just to make absolutely sure that there's no way to slip past that guy. Here I bump up the brightness to maximum, and you can see it doesn't help at all. That's something that if you were to play this in the remastered version of the game, you see here, even with maximum brightness, it still doesn't approach just how bright they've illuminated the world in the remastered version of this game. Something that I think is a benefit of seeing me repeatedly die is you can see that my frustration level grows through my gameplay. I become a lot more impatient. Instead of taking ladders, I'm just starting to roll off the ledges, and I'm a little bit more reckless with moving through this area because I'm getting very frustrated. You can see there, I got hung up on the ladder because the game ate my input, and I believe it happens again here. No, it's another ladder. Because the frame rate is so low, it introduces input latency, so some of my inputs either come out late or they don't register at all. That's really the biggest issue with low frame rate. It's not so much that it looks bad, which it does, but it's more so that I want to press a button and I want to have an input. Like, I'm already being punished to a severe extent in this part of the game because there are a lot of choke points where enemies cluster together. like this one right here. You can't really sneak past this enemy, you've got to kill him. I'm already contending with enough challenge as is. To have that compounded with bad input delay just makes it a less enjoyable part of the game. That's why I wind up skipping Blighttown. Not because I want to spend less time playing the game, but the reason why I take the shortcut is just because I don't want to deal with this frame rate issue. Being poisoned as you traverse this swamp winds up not being as big of an issue as it really should have been. I think this would have been an interesting dynamic where you're trying to contend with this gradual health loss while you're fighting the boss, but not only do enemies here drop poison moss, the ticks are so small that they really wind up not being an issue. I think you can heal off all of the poison damage with one Estus flask, which is a pretty decent trade-off. What would have made this more interesting is if you were forced to fight Quelaag in a poisonous swamp, and this is something that Dark Souls 2 did with... You're gonna have to forgive me, I know very little of that game because the last time I played it was when it was new, back in, when was it, 2013? But I remember there was like a Medusa boss that you fight in a poisonous room, and I think you can drain the poison. That's something that I don't like. I wish they committed to having that be a fight that you have to fight the boss while under the influence of a status effect. Having to consider dealing with a status effect while fighting a boss is something that not a lot of games do, but it's something interesting that I find. I like when developers try to find new ways to deal with bosses rather than just dodging enemy attacks. And speaking of, Quelaag is a pretty interesting fight and one of the better ones in the game, despite her being a pretty easy fight overall, although you can see that I do have a death on record. I'll show that here. And this ties into one of the parts of boss design that I don't think enough developers lean into, and it really feels like some untapped potential. I think a developer could really stand to benefit from designing bosses this way, and that is using the environment in a unique fashion during the boss fight. So Quelaag, she gives you a lot of room to maneuver around in, but because she spits out these lingering fire puddles, that gives reason towards having this huge arena. It's not like the Gaping Dragon where you have this big fight to avoid the boss's attacks. In this fight, Quelaag doesn't have a lot of long-reaching attacks. That's probably the longest-reaching one she has, is hitting with her sword. You don't need to necessarily worry about fighting Quelaag, you need to worry about having good situational awareness, because if you wind up getting caught between her and a puddle, and she does that shout attack, you can back up into a puddle and die, and I'll show that footage here. That's how I died against her the first time. So the challenge comes more from having a good awareness of your environment and knowing where these puddles are, and less from a hard memorization of a boss's attack patterns. I really like that type of level design. That's something that's also present in Demon Souls when you're fighting the Man-Eaters. What gives that fight its challenge is you're fighting it on a bridge, and not only can you accidentally roll off the platform and die, the boss has attacks that can push you around, so he can knock you off and you'll plummet to your death. It becomes a fight where you don't want to have your back towards that gap, you want to have your back facing the center of the arena. That way if you get knocked around, you'll know that you'll have safe room to fall back on. Same thing with this fight, where instead of having those bottomless pits in the arena, you've got these parts of the environment that are very dynamically changing throughout the whole fight. It's not a static stage hazard. They disappear and she'll create new ones. This is something that I had to relearn how to fight this boss because I was keeping a lot of distance between me and her, and you'll see that the more passive you are, the more she'll play the long game. She wants you to fall into these puddles to take damage and die, so even if she can't necessarily reach you with her attacks, you see I have my back towards the puddle, I need to maneuver my way so that if I need to dodge, I'm not dodging into danger, and you'll see right there, she does that attack. Thankfully I was able to partially block it, but if I had my back towards that puddle, I would have died. Not only would I have been knocked backwards, I would have been knocked into the puddle, and I would have taken immense damage, and that would have been the end of it. So it becomes less of just this fight of attrition of you learning a boss's patterns, and more about maneuvering the boss, moving her around the level. I really like having that movement aspect, because when you consider what you're doing most of the time in a video game, it's not so much fighting so much as it is moving around. If it was just combat, then it would be Punch-Out. You have this movement part of a game, and you move around, but I think it's pretty interesting to also be able to tether to the boss and move her around the environment. So as many compliments I can give this fight in terms of how it makes use of space, I'm gonna have to have a pretty serious complaint here, and that is once I learned, or rather relearned, how to fight this boss by staying very aggressive, you'll come to see that having that part of dealing with stage hazards really becomes less of an issue because she winds up not using those attacks if you stay close. You'll see here, if you're right under her, she'll constantly spam melee attacks. And sometimes she'll back up and you can just repeat the process like I'm doing here. But sometimes she'll spit lava. It's not consistent. I wish she spat lava more. But having that part of the fight where you need to have good situational awareness and pay attention to the dynamically changing environment, that's something that really only becomes obvious when you're playing very passively, because you see here, the more aggressive I am, the less inclined she is to use those lava spitting attacks. But even though she's still a fairly easy fight, that doesn't make her a bad fight. Like I said at the start of this boss segment, I want to see fights be more about making interesting use of space and doing something unique with their mechanics. I like that you can maneuver Quelaag around the environment. If she's standing in a lava puddle, you can pull her out of it and give yourself some more room to fight her safely. That's something that makes her a unique fight. Not just in Dark Souls, but I think in most of FromSoftware's library, and most action RPGs that try to copy Souls in general. I don't see very many of them employ this type of boss design where you want to move the boss out of these danger zones and she constantly creates new ones. Feels like a lot of developers are taking the very easy lessons to learn from FromSoft, which is just make the boss really difficult and force the player to memorize patterns. But you can see here, knowing how to move around an environment is not about pattern memorization. It challenges a different skill set. Knowing how to maneuver around this environment because of these stage hazards is not as challenging as memorizing a pattern, especially in the newer FromSoft game like the Elden Ring DLC. Knowing where to sidestep this lava and to not have your back towards it, that's not a difficult concept to get your hands around. But this is not a late game boss, this is an early one. It's not trying to be this brutal challenge, it's just trying to have a more unique boss fight. And when you look at the repertoire of bosses that we've fought already, Quelaag stands out in a very distinct way because she has those lingering hitboxes. This is one of those bits of Dark Souls design that's very easy to praise, and I'm sure you've seen it commonly from other people's videos. They like how you can see upcoming parts of the environment from where you are right now. This is a type of philosophy that was inherited from Kingsfield. So when a lot of people say that Demon Souls and Dark Souls are spiritual successors to the Kingsfield series, there are a lot of parts of it that you can make direct comparisons to, so things like the stamina system. But for me, the biggest point of inheritance comes from the level design, especially having played Kingsfield 4. Man, I sound like a Kingsfield 4 apologist at this point. I promise I don't love that game. But what Kingsfield 4 does that is absolutely one of the highlights, not just of Kingsfield, but in that it trumps most other games, is the interconnectedness of its environment. You have that sense of familiarity where once you return to this central tower from one of the adjacent zones, you can see that you've made significant progress. You're like, whoa, I made it down a story from where I was last time. So you've got this gradual sense of progression that comes from just looking at where you are in the environment. He makes this leap here, although you're going to see, not having the HUD, I didn't know how much health I had, so this attack killed me. So I have to assume that FromSoft designed that boss to be fought in two primary ways. The first, of course, is baiting him to jump and then knocking his tentacle so he falls off. What you're going to see here is that you cannot bait the boss to jump if you've already picked up the armor set and despawned from the zone. He won't leap and you won't be able to hit his tentacle to make him fall. What you have to do is go back to where that armor set was and then once again run back towards the fog gate to once again bait him to make that jumping attack. I don't think that that's very obvious. So what From Software did, and I imagine this is something that playtesting helped out with, was they created that little carved entryway into the rock structure where you can hide in there and bait tentacle slams. That's a very boring way to fight this boss, and it's not challenging, and it's certainly not interesting where you're just fishing one attack over and over again and farming through his enormous health bar. But I don't really think baiting the boss towards the fog gate to kill him is interesting either. So on one hand, I do praise From Software, at least in these earlier Souls releases, for having unique boss fights, but this is one where just because it's unique doesn't mean it's done particularly well. I'm all in favor of having non-traditional boss fights if there are interesting ways to go about felling them. This is not a very interesting way. It's really the knockback that deters me from wanting to fight this boss in a conventional format where I just dodge attacks and punish. Because you can't block that lava tentacle slam, and trying to roll through it is very difficult because the attack starts from off screen. He's such a large boss and the field of view is so narrow that you can see his tentacle is lifted off screen. I don't know when he's beginning the downward descent. If his tentacles did not induce knockback, then I would be more inclined to fight him in a one-on-one straight-up fight, but because he knocks you back, and because the damage is so extreme, it really motivates me to take a more cheap approach to fighting him, either through luring him to jump and fall to his death, or running into that narrow entryway and baiting tentacle slams. So when you pull that second Bell of Awakening, there's a cutscene that plays that shows you that Sen's Fortress opens, and that is your cue to escape Blighttown. So it's very easy to keep pushing yourself further into the Demon Ruins and then eventually hitting that orange fog wall that's a hard gate preventing you from progressing. But this is one point where I will actually applaud the incorporation of a cutscene in a video game, because that cutscene, you know that now I need to head back up to the surface. So when you see that water wheel, that elevator heading straight up, and it's in a very confined, condensed portion of the map, it's tucked in this alcove, and contrasting that wide, open, slow descent when you're initially heading down Blighttown, this elevator takes you straight up in a fairly quick fashion. You saw that I came back up to Firelink Shrine in no time at all. You are meant to make that connection that I need to escape here, and you're supposed to look for a structure that will lead you back up in a fairly quick manner. I don't think that most players would assume that they would need to make that daunting trek back up through Blighttown the same way they came and then try to escape from the depths. I think that would be an unreasonable ask of the players. On the other hand, if the game did take that approach, I think that would be very interesting because it presents a different challenge from the same environment. It's a way to use a level in two ways to create two different types of challenges. With flat terrain and with a brightly lit environment, it's very easy to make out which direction you're supposed to take, and because you have a lot of room to make out where you are in your surroundings, you can fairly confidently make it forward and backward through an area with minimal issue. But because Blighttown is so dark, and because your initial trek through it was descending, if you were to ask that player to head back up and you were to keep it dark, they would have a wildly different experience trying to escape Blighttown. And I think that would actually pose a pretty interesting challenge, is asking a player, this is not something that you're ever asked to do, but just would make for, I think, a pretty fun challenge, would be trying to make your way out of Blighttown the long way rather than taking the shortcut, because it would ask you to interact with the environment in a different approach. Rather than looking for shortcuts to roll off the ledge and make your way down, now you need to climb these ladders, and that puts you in a vulnerable position because when you aggro all these enemies and they follow after you, you have to slow your pace to climb these ladders, and that gives them an opportunity to hit you. So it would be a way to create an interesting challenge in two different ways. The first is trying to descend Blighttown without falling down these bottomless pits. That's not something that you necessarily need to worry about when you're ascending Blighttown. Instead, the challenge will come from fighting the enemies, whereas you saw when I was heading down Blighttown the first time, all I did was run past the enemies because I was afforded enough room with the level geometry to just side skirt them. It tries to trip you up a few times with narrow platforms and shaky bridges, but for the most part, it's pretty easy to just side skirt the enemies and run past them. You can see here I'm messing around with dumping points into strength and dexterity to see if it's worth the minuscule stat gains, but because the Claymore has very low scaling in both of those attacking stats, I decided to abandon that decision and pump the rest of my souls into leveling up Vitality. This ties into what I was saying earlier with when you're allowed to respec your character, you don't need to worry about contemplating if your decision is worthwhile, because if I pump in all my points into strength and later on I pick up a dexterity weapon, I can just reallocate my stats to make use of that new weapon. And that is something that a lot of players make an argument for being able to respec their character, because they don't know what to expect when they play through the game. They may find a weapon that is more appealing, but with the build that they've created, they can no longer afford to dump stats to make worthwhile use of that weapon. And that creates a situation where players will be like, how can you deny me the opportunity of using this gear that I found hours into a game? I didn't expect to pick it up, I didn't know of its existence, and now I can't use it. Well, you should let me respec my stat points, that way I can use it. I view that as, that's replay value. I can replay the game, hey, this is a weapon or armor set that I can use on the next attempt. Sense Fortress is my favorite level in the game, and it is not fair in the slightest. And this is actually deliberate. This is why I said I don't think FromSoftware's games are fair, because the online interactivity in Dark Souls is what affords FromSoftware the leeway to make unfair levels and have them not feel too punishing, because you can see here that trap that triggers the arrows. If you were to play this online, you would see a sign there, guaranteed, someone would say trap. So that perceived unfairness is dialed back a bit when you realize that you can play these games online, and a lot of these players are going to be reading hints from other players that may have already suffered through these unfair segments. But if you play offline, you don't have those hints, and then a lot of the traps in Sense Fortress become very punishing because your expectations are set right at the start. It takes not 3 steps into Sense Fortress to realize what you're walking into because you have that pressure plate trap, which I think is very smart to put that there early on because it sets expectations for the remainder of this dungeon. There are many more pressure plate traps, and you saw that I lured those snake men into it. That's something that you can... It's going to be a little bit more difficult, like there's a trap behind this guy. You could try to maneuver around him and activate the trap and have that kill this enemy, but instead I just decide to kill him right before hitting that trap, and then I just walk my way around it. But this is another part of game design where you can use the environment against the enemies. That's why I think Sense Fortress is so cool, and if you didn't make the connection with both of those pressure plates on your way into Sense Fortress, here is the most blatant example, where you see the boulder hit the snakemen. You are meant to use the traps against these enemies. In fact, that's why the difficulty spike here is so high. These snakemen have a ton of health, and they're pretty heavily armored because they don't stagger easily from one hit from the Claymore. You see here, he ate that. It takes 2 hits to stagger the snakemen. I really like that you're able to avoid taking the long way through Sense Fortress if you're brave enough to head up the path that the boulder's coming down. You can create these shorter paths through the area if you go against instinct. Instinct would tell me that this boulder is coming from up high, don't go up there, follow the downward path and look for a safe route. But if you go against what your instinct is, you'll find that you can get through the level in a much quicker fashion. There's an important audio cue in this part, because even though I adjusted the boulder's rotation, having taken that little detour to free that NPC, it allowed this boulder to reorient itself to the default position. So even though Dark Souls doesn't have any ambient music, which is a point of criticism that I have that I don't see hardly anybody bring up, is this game is severely lacking in music, which I think would help elevate its atmosphere. In fact, that's something that Kingsfield does much better. You'll hear, I have it mixed very low, but I've been playing some Kingsfield music during this video, and it's very appropriate for the level design of this game. I think it fits really well. But even though there's no music, the audio design becomes a very important part of navigating Sen's Fortress, because even though I adjusted that boulder's trajectory, when I came to that choke point where I wanted to head back up from where it was coming from, if you listen closely, you can hear that that contraption is being reoriented. Here's another part of pretty game design 101, where you introduce one concept in isolation, and as you progress through the environment, you compound them. You have this wide platform in the beginning with the swinging pendulums, and you're given enough room to stop between each one. And as you progress upwards through Sen's Fortress, it eventually reaches that point where the bridge becomes very narrow, and the swinging pendulums are clustered together very quickly. Plus, you've got an enemy throwing projectiles, so you're meant to sprint through this, and then at the end, the little cherry on top is you've got that pressure plate to catch you off guard if you were just running through blindly without paying attention. So you can see that FromSoft is combining these elements and ratcheting up the intensity as you maneuver through the level. Finding that bonfire is, again, something that feels a little bit too unfair if you're playing this offline for the first time, because I'm sure if you're playing online, you're going to see a soapstone sign there that says, hey, come here to find the bonfire. But because of how this place is absolutely laden with traps, and you can see here this lingering fire hitbox hits me 3 times, which is absolutely absurd. So I have to imagine that putting that bonfire there was something that was a choice that was made to further solidify the worthwhileness of having that asynchronous online interaction where players can leave messages. If this game was designed without any sort of online interaction at all, if this was designed entirely within the context of it being a purely single-player game, I think we would see a lot less of these hidden bonfires and a lot of these traps designed to catch you off guard. Also owing to my theory that that bonfire was designed explicitly for multiplayer purposes, here's a shortcut that takes you all the way back to the entrance of Sen's Fortress. So even if you don't find that bonfire, not all hope is lost if you wind up suffering to the Iron Giant, because you do have this nifty shortcut that leads you back towards the Undead Parish. You'll notice that it's very difficult to see the details of your character's face, which is why I don't really care about character creators in video games anymore. I used to spend an hour fine-tuning every detail, but when you realize that with the armor set on and the fact that the shield is blocking my head, and I'm playing some games in first person, they have custom character creation menus, and it's like, I don't hardly ever see my character's face outside of cutscenes. And I'm very prone to skipping cutscenes as is these days, and Dark Souls has very few cutscenes to begin with, so I'm not really sure what the purpose is of even having a character creator. I know a lot of players appreciate that feature, but when you consider the gameplay experience, I'm not ever looking at my character's face. Not only am I looking at him from behind the entire time, I have armor on. And with this particular armor set, this hood blocks my face entirely. So this looks like I am disoriented and don't know how to make my way through this forest, but the reality is I just wanted to aggro every enemy and get hit by everything to show you a little tour of the forest. It's not at all that I'm lost and don't know where to go, because I haven't done this in many years. Ah yes, head back to where you came from. Coming up next is textbook Dark Souls unpatched gameplay. This is what everyone did when the game was new. This was priority number 1. This is what you wanted to do, is immediately join this covenant. And there's an invisible NPC here, and he's the only one in the game that has the Darkwood Green Ring. And he's very conveniently positioned at the edge of this cliff. I think his position was modified in a patch. He might have been brought a little bit closer to Shiva. But you can see here I unequip my Pyromancy glove because I want to kick him off the ledge and steal his ring. Doing so aggroes the NPCs in this covenant, but I don't really care, because paramount of importance at this point is quitting out reloading and picking up that Darkwood Green Ring. In this unpatched version of Dark Souls, and I think this was addressed maybe a month or two after launch, maybe longer, it's hard to say, but it was certainly before the DLC. This ring was nerfed. If you are at 50% or less of your equipment burden, this ring modifies your roll to give you not only more iframes, but it also makes it faster than the fast roll. That was pretty quickly changed to make it so that you only get that fast roll if you're at 25% or less equip burden. This was a significant change because one of the most popular PvP builds was to be fully decked out in Havel's armor, wear the Havel's ring, and wear the Darkwood green ring. I'm not a big fan of nerfing video games or buffing them. I like the original vision presented as is, for better and worse. Dark Souls and a lot of FromSoftware's games, they tried to support them after release with various buffs and nerfs. They tried to nerf a lot of the more blatantly overpowered and easy to access strategies and equipment. And they tend to buff some of the weapons to bring them more in line with the others. They try to achieve parity so that way one weapon doesn't eclipse use over all the others. And they oftentimes tend to nerf bosses. I'm not sure if any bosses were nerfed in Dark Souls, but to give you an example of certain things that were buffed, the enemies, all of them across the board, drop more souls, which makes it so you level up much faster. There's also modifiers to merchant NPC item inventories. I already talked about how that merchant in the waterways sells purging stones. Some of the bosses drop homeward bones and humanities. Weapons have had their scaling adjusted. Some of them achieve higher tier scaling. And I think all of them have a higher percentage gain from allocating stats. Really not a fan of this enemy. Not only is he a giant in a tiny platform and you need to contend with an abysmal camera, it also encourages a cheesy type of behavior where, in this case, I hide in the well and pop my head out when I bait one specific attack, and that's just the same strategy that I repeat over and over. That's not really a fight. That's just pattern recognition where you see a stimulus and you respond with the appropriate output. So in that first attempt, the Iron Golem stomped me, and I didn't even realize that the knockback on that move was that extreme. But it's nothing compared to the embarrassment that I feel when the Iron Golem picks me up and throws me off the bridge, not once, but twice. So I get stuck on this boss for a little bit, and that's because he has way too much health to fight him in a straight-up fight in the center of the platform. But you'll notice there have been several fights in this game that have alternative win conditions, and I think that's still part of that lingering DNA from Demon Souls that hasn't quite yet been shed, but will inevitably be shed in the later games in the FromSoftware library, where both Iron Golem and Ceaseless Discharge can be knocked off the boss platform to skip their fights. I like having that type of alternative win condition where you don't need to fight a boss one particular way, and in fact it feels like you're incentivized to take this route to kill these bosses just because of how much health they have. On the subject of boss health, here's one part of Dark Souls design that I have to criticize a bit, and this is going to sound ironic coming from someone that predominantly plays RPGs and loves the genre. I think Dark Souls would be better suited as a straightforward action game if it shed its RPG elements, and that's something that Sekiro did, and I think a lot of players appreciate that. And that's also what made Sekiro bring up that discussion of difficulty in video games and if a game can be too difficult. Because these RPG elements are exclusively used to curb that difficulty. A lot of these bosses that I've fought, you'll notice that in the Gaping Dragon and in Quelaag and certainly against the Iron Golem, they all have way too much health. I just upgraded my sword to plus 10 and look how much damage this boss is taking from my attacks. And that's intentional in this case because you can see he's meant to fall off the bridge. That's an alternative win condition. But so many of these bosses do not have alternative win conditions. You're meant to have this long-winded slog against them like in the Quelaag fight. Fighting against Quelaag, that was a 10-minute ordeal for me just because my weapon wasn't upgraded sufficiently. But if I engaged with more RPG layers, like if I upgraded my sword, if I dumped more points into my offensive stats, if I had an item that enchanted my weapon, I would all of a sudden be doing a ton more damage to the boss. And that ties into this sort of immutable design aspect with RPGs, where how do you dissociate that progression layer where each player has a different part of progression and each one feels a different sense of satisfaction from upgrading their gear and acquiring levels? How do you dissociate that from the challenge that a boss offers? Because the more a player becomes powerful, the less impactful a boss feels. If I'm doing so much damage that I'm killing these bosses in 15 or 20 seconds, which it could be the case with Quelaag, like if you get the Black Knight Halberd and you hit her human torso, you can stun lock her, and that fight can be over in a matter of seconds. If you do that, you miss out on that entire situational awareness benefit that's exclusive to that fight. So how do you remove those options from a player being able to abuse and make these fights much easier? If the game is an RPG and you afford them all these options, that's just something that you have to accept. Some players are going to be taking the easy way out, and I don't think that that's necessarily a wrong path to take, because ultimately with the presence of all these options, it's going to be up to the individual to determine how to self-balance the game. That's something that just comes with the RPG territory. Anor Londo, to me, is a waste of potential, because you can see that this is such a gorgeous, ornate, intricate level. This could be an entire game in and of itself. In fact, I wish that's what Dark Souls was. I wish this game took entirely within place of Anor Londo, because it's so absolutely enormous, yet the path that you proceed down through it is exceptionally linear and really isn't all that interesting, especially coming off the trap-laden masterpiece of level design that is Sen's Fortress, and how Blighttown toys with level design expectations because of how dark it is. Here you've got this bright, intricate, ornately detailed structure, yet the amount of time you spend within its walls is very shockingly brief. This is a part of game design where it ties into my frustrations with this push for huge, expansive worlds like open world games. I don't like open world games because they forsake a lot of the intricate, interwoven level design that can only take place if your scope of your game is smaller. The more structures you add and the wider your field of exploration is, the more you need to forsake that type of intricate, interwoven level design. And that is something that I think is a concession made in Anor Londo, where there was so much time spent modeling this beautiful castle structure and the surrounding town, and it's just this wonderful fortress. I would love to explore it in more detail, but so much of you can only explore like maybe 5% of what is on offer here. The regions before this, like Blighttown, I think had much more places to explore, and that has to do with it being smaller in scope but a lot more intricate. This is much larger in scope, but it represents just a tiny fraction of the game. I think it was Warren Spector that said his ideal game would take place on one street and you would just be able to explore every house in immaculate, intricate detail and have an almost unbelievable level of interaction that can only be afforded. You would only be able to have that type of detailed exploration if the overall scope of your game is quite small. You'll notice that developers, when they make open world games, and FromSoft is guilty of this with Elden Ring, they have a lot of wide open fields and a lot of flat terrain, and they try to populate that terrain with like these little pockets of attractions, sort of like it's a theme park. You want to go to the little themed areas, but for the most part, it's this wide open field, and to facilitate exploration, they give you a mount, and they'll give you a horse, or they'll give you a car. So much of these games are not spent exploring these intricate environments. It's instead spent moving from place to place, and I think that's something where if you were to rip out all of that, if you were to rip out that central hub that serves as the foundation of an open world game, and you would instead just present its disparate locations as a level select, kind of like what Demon Souls does, that would cut away a lot of the filler moving around in these games. You wouldn't have to have a horse to move you from point A to point B. If you were to strip that out and just present these games as a level select, what would you really be missing out on? Because I'll tell you, I don't really like running around large open fields on a horse. That's not fun gameplay. Fun gameplay is something that is comprised of a lot of meaningful choices. There's not really a meaningful choice to be made if you're given an objective marker on your map and it's a long distance away and you just move in a straight line on your horse, or if you fast travel to that point. These are concessions that are made for the point of convenience because these developers know that players are not going to want to spend hours moving from A to B. If I were to illustrate it, it would be if you have 2 points and there's a line connecting them. What if you just remove the line connecting them, and once you're done with 1 point, you immediately start on the next one? What purpose does that connecting line really serve? As far as I'm concerned, that is the worst part of these open world games. Take that away, give us a traditional level select, and that is less time that's spent making these huge environments. Nice fall here. That's less time that's spent making these huge environments, and that's more time that could be spent enhancing these stages that look large and vast, but when you actually dive into them, you'll realize that they're really quite shallow. So the video originally ended at around this point. I didn't continue playing through the game all the way through to the end. This was about a 2-hour long commentary. But I thought that that was an unfinished video, and I didn't want to push out something that really didn't feel complete. So I wound up playing through the rest of the game, and here's about another 2 hours worth of commentary that I'm going to record. This is done against my better judgment because this became a project that ballooned into something pretty gargantuan for at least my taste. I didn't want to have this be a 4-hour long sort of introspective analysis of Dark Souls because I don't really love this game. I don't know how well that came across in the commentary so far, but I don't harbor the same love for Dark Souls that most of the rest of the internet does. And though I have a lot of positive things to say about it, really my distaste comes from what's going to come up after Anor Londo. It's the second half of this game. I'm truly not a fan of the second half of Dark Souls, and even though it's more open-ended and that explorative aspect shines more brightly than the first half does, and that's something that I do strongly value, it just becomes a sort of a grind to push myself to finish this game, because if the game ended at this part, it would be a taut, about 4-hour long campaign, and I would be more inclined to replay it with more frequency. But as I grow older, my tastes have changed pretty drastically. Like, I used to play this game religiously when it was new, and I never thought it was too long, but nowadays, I'm pretty satisfied with everything that it has to offer. Just cleaning up Anor Londo, progressing past that point feels like a chore. This is something that I have to imagine was another thing that was a result of player feedback, where these enemies leap to their death as they chase after you, and I don't really know why that's the case. I always thought that's strange. You've got these enemies that are brave enough to run. You see he sprints across this narrow beam, and yet he's so clumsy that he trips and falls to his death as he tries to attack you. I can't imagine that that was the original intent with the design of these enemies. In fact, I think this would make for a more interesting encounter if these enemies didn't leap to their death, because of the environment in which you're forced to fight them. You see how narrow these are. You can't really rely on rolling to the left and right to dodge their attacks like you can in almost every single other area. There's some precarious ledges in Blighttown, but even in that situation, you saw that I'm able to pull enemies out into safer areas that are more brightly lit and wide open. You can create more room for yourself to roll around, but in this situation, short of rolling backwards away from the enemy, which you can't do around some of these corners where they try to ambush you, it's very difficult to deal with the challenge of playing defensively here. Here's another thing that I'm not too keen on, which is downgrading bosses into normal enemies, although in this sense, these gargoyles are not so much normal enemies, they are mini bosses because they don't respawn, but their patterns are not different from the first time you fight them, so they're not a threat. Especially because you don't have to deal with any surrounding normal enemies, which is something that could have made these more challenging if you had to deal with maybe some hollows like 2 or 3, or maybe some of those painting guardians if they were here on this platform. You would have to deal with crowd control. That is a situation that would make this a more challenging encounter. But even the first time you fight the gargoyles, you have to fight 2 at a time. Not the entire fight, but the second one ambushes you mid-fight. That original boss encounter is more challenging than fighting them individually here on these rotating bridge structures. So I have to imagine this is something that was added last minute. This was not intentional design, because the run back from between bonfires here, the one where the firekeeper is, and this entrance to the proper castle structure of Anor Londo, this is a very long run. So probably to make it a little bit more interesting, someone on the design staff decided to put those gargoyles, like, we have this enemy asset, let's just reuse it here so this doesn't feel quite so empty. I really do think that they made Anor Londo way too big, and they didn't find enough interesting things to populate it with, both in terms of enemy encounters and in terms of just general exploration and finding secrets. Here's another nice contrast in level design where the original approach in Anor Londo to get to this bonfire inside of this central area, it's very long-winded, there's not a whole lot of enemies, and then instead the game tries to create situations where they want you to fall off a ledge to your doom. That's not the same approach to the level design that was taken inside of this proper structure. Instead, this is reliant a lot more on claustrophobic combat encounters and, of course, these mimic chests that I choose to ignore. But with how the player's been playing through the game, you've already been conditioned to not run blindly into doors and to check around every corner for ambushes. In fact, that's something that I'll do right here. This is not what I would consider to be unfair. Maybe in the beginning of the game where these enemies are tucked around corners, that would be considered unfair, but at this point in the game, because you've grown accustomed to how the developers chose to place enemies in these environments, you already should be accustomed to checking around every corner and moving slowly through unfamiliar territory. During the marketing for Dark Souls, there was a music video that served as a trailer. It was called Bartholomew. I believe that was the name of the song that played during the trailer. And it was a collection of cutscenes, mostly boss cutscenes, set to music. And it stood out because I don't think that there are very many trailers for video games, especially nowadays, that try to present themselves as music videos. A lot of trailers now try to show off the story, and you'll notice that during my discussion of this game that I have not discussed the story or lore of Dark Souls in any capacity. And that is because of 2 reasons. Number 1, I don't find it terribly interesting. The plot of Dark Souls is practically non-existent, and I don't really care much for learning the backstory for any piece of media. And number 2 is I'm not particularly good at talking about stories in video games, which is why I don't do it that often. And you could argue that I'm not good at talking about gameplay either, but at least I have more experience talking about gameplay systems and mechanics. I don't really have anywhere near the same amount of experience talking about the qualities of a game's story. A lot of video game story discussion tends to revolve around plot synopsis rather than a discussion of themes or motifs or all of these other parts of literature analysis that are very difficult to talk about, which is probably why a lot of players don't delve into that. If I were to ever talk about a narrative in a video game, I would not want it to just be a recital of a Wikipedia page. I would want it to delve into more of an analysis on why the story is told a certain way. And I'm just not really good at doing something like that because I don't have much interest in narratives anyway. I don't really have that much interest in Dark Souls either. This is nowhere near one of my favorite games. So I have to wonder why this is now the second time I've played through this game for this YouTube channel and done commentary over the footage for a game that I proclaim to be not anywhere near what I would consider one of my favorites, although not a bad game by any stretch, and a game that I do have a lot of fond memories of during that initial playthrough. So I guess in a sense this is less of me talking about a game that I really love and more of trying to reminisce about why I enjoyed this game the first time I played it, and try to introduce some parts of game design discussion that I find interesting. So I broke my rule earlier where I said I don't kindle bonfires, but that's because I didn't want to be stuck against Ornstein and Smo for a few hours. I'm not particularly great at fighting this boss, so I do kindle this bonfire. However, to be fair, I do wind up beating Ornstein's Smo on my first attempt, and I only go down to 5 Estus flasks. So just pretend like this kindling didn't matter. Coming up is a rather famous shortcut, which is the staircase jump to skip the run back to the boss. The runbacks become quite egregious in this back half of Dark Souls, and I have to say that's probably my #1 complaint with my experience in playing the second half of this game, is because I'm not very good at playing this game, I do wind up dying to bosses. I'm not ashamed of dying to bosses, and I accept the punishment that comes with them. However, I do think that it's punishing enough to already lose your souls, to lose your human status, and to reset the boss to its initial state with full health. That's punishment enough. I don't think that running back to the boss is a worthwhile punishment, because the only thing that it costs is time. What happens is, I just wind up running past every enemy along the way, because I just want to have another shot at fighting the boss. I don't really want to use up my resources fighting the little enemies that block my path to the boss. These runbacks, the only thing that they wind up doing is bloating the runtime of the game. And you could make the argument that, well, if you were better at the game, you would not have to run back to a boss at all. And I would accept that argument. However, dying and failure is something that I've accepted as part of the gameplay experience, so it's something that I enjoy in many cases, because, for example, I'll use a shmup. When you die in the 3rd or 4th stage of a shoot 'em up, and you have no more reserve lives, and you have to rely on that continue, and you choose not to rely on that continue and start over from the beginning, you have an opportunity to go through those earlier sections with better efficiency. You can maybe reach the point where you died with more ships in reserve, or if you play for score, you can become more efficient with how you choose to move through levels and which enemies you choose to kill and how you choose to engage with the scoring system. So even though you're repeating content, it doesn't feel quite as repetitious as running back to a boss in Dark Souls, because you have an opportunity to flex your skill, to show how much you've matured as a player. There is no way to show how much you've matured as a player when the only thing you're doing is holding the sprint button until you run out of stamina, then releasing, and then sprinting again, and repeating the process, running past every enemy on your way to reach a boss. You're not becoming any better at movement, you're not engaging with any sort of scoring system. In very few instances are you able to utilize tricks or shortcuts. In this specific case, the run back to Ornstein's Smo, you could argue that that staircase skip has some degree of mastery involved where you can become more consistent with doing it, and that is one run back that I don't have a problem with for that very reason, where if you become consistent at performing that staircase skip, which requires genuine skill, you can minimize the amount of time it takes to reach the boss. If that type of design was incorporated in the runbacks for the other bosses, then I really wouldn't have an issue with it. But a lot of them, it really is just running through a straight line without being able to utilize any sort of shortcuts. Ornstein's Smo is a fight that I like conceptually, but not so much in practice. So like I said during the fight against Quelaag, where that was also a test of situational awareness, but with just one enemy, this is a test of situational awareness in a different sense, where you need to be aware of where the enemy that you aren't fighting is at all times. He is the threat, not the enemy that you're locked onto and engaged with. Traditional boss fights in most action games are typically one-on-one encounters, and that doesn't really test your ability to control a crowd. But when you look at what you're doing for the majority of combat in an action game, it's fighting groups of enemies as you explore these stages. If you have a boss fight that's meant to test the skills that you've developed that entire time, it would make more sense to test your crowd control abilities rather than just straightforward pattern memorization, because you still have that pattern memorization aspect with the enemy that you're locked onto in this fight, but with the added challenge of having to avoid attacks from a crowd, you have this extra threat present and you need to use parts of the environment to keep them at bay. That's the same sort of skill set that you developed when you were exploring these areas, when you had to contend with multiple threats at once. You had to find ways to keep one of them at a distance so you can whittle them away one at a time. You don't have the type of moveset that can cut down a huge crowd of enemies all at once. It's a very small weapon overall when you look at the size of the threat that you're fighting. It looks like a big weapon and it swings slow, but it's not really suited to fight these types of enemies at the same time, which is why there are these pillars in the environment to keep the enemy at a distance. Try to imagine fighting Ornstein and Smo without these collapsed pillars to help you create some spacing between the threats. So that's an aspect of this boss fight that I want to praise. It's this first phase, where the enemy that you're targeting is a lot more aggressive, and the one that you aren't targeting is a little bit more restrained. You can see Smo is not charging towards me and is being as aggressive as he really should. The AI adjusts a little bit depending on the enemy that the game assumes that you're currently targeting, or so I like to believe. I'm sure that's not actually the case, but with the way that you can control the enemy that you're not currently attacking with these broken pillars, it certainly feels like the AI is sort of scaling to suit whichever enemy that you're currently engaged with. But once you switch over to the second phase, it becomes a one-on-one engagement similar to most of the other boss fights. It loses that element where you can use the environment to control the bosses to your favor, because that really only comes into play when you have two targets. When it's just one, it's very easy to keep the target in your sight. You don't need to use the pillars to create space. It's a lot easier to contend with just that single enemy. You see that item off in the distance that Ornstein dropped. I can't remember if he always dropped his ring and you needed to pick it up. I was under the impression that it was just added to your inventory when the boss was completed, but that was something that was probably instituted as a change in a patch. The other noteworthy thing about this boss fight is because Smo's hammer is imbued with an element, you can't rely on blocking the attack, and I've been relying on exactly that to get me through most of the encounters in the game. So I wind up dodge rolling through most of his attacks. FromSoft does at least make a dedicated effort to discourage passive play. However, the way they've gone about implementing that feels a little bit repetitious, especially with how frequently they've been reusing ideas and boss mechanics. It really does feel like FromSoft is lacking that creative sparkle that was present in games like Demon's Souls and Dark Souls, where I think they were a little bit more experimental with how they chose to design their bosses. I'm opening up myself to some criticism here because I am not at all a fan of Elden Ring, and I'm sure there are plenty of players that would be willing to rebuttal my points and say, what do you mean? Elden Ring is an immensely creative game, and its creative energy radiates more brightly than anything that is exhibited in Dark Souls, and that's not a subject that I would really be willing to argue against, because I think it would be fascinating to see players defend any sort of creative liberties that Elden Ring has taken in regards to exploration and boss design. It feels like a lot of videos I've seen that praise that game praise it in ways that I don't find particularly compelling. They don't really go into depth in terms of the uniqueness of each boss and how each boss tests a different skill set. And I don't think you could really talk about how each boss tests a different skill set with the amount of reused content that's present in Elden Ring, not just in terms of the repetitive caves that you're traversing, but also the amount of times that the bosses are reused. So even if you were willing to make the argument that Elden Ring has a robust selection of creative bosses, a lot of that praise is curtailed a bit when you realize that these bosses are reused, and that's why I said even in Dark Souls, I'm not a fan of these boss fights being demoted into normal enemy mobs. That's one thing where it feels like with Dark Souls, a lot of these environments were designed without consideration of how the moment-to-moment exploration would play out. These enemy placements just don't really seem to make a whole lot of sense, and that's why you see sometimes that these bosses have been demoted into normal enemies, and that's probably something where the developers ran out of time in the Demon Ruins, and maybe even a bit here in Anor Londo, where they created these huge environments. But as the deadline approached, they realized that they didn't have enough time to create new enemies to populate these environments with, so they took a shortcut by reusing bosses. What you're about to see is the 1.0 version of fast travel in Dark Souls. There are not very many fast travel points that were included in this original release of the game. Because these bosses are placed at the end of a stage, at a dead end, why couldn't this just have been presented as a level select similar to Demon's Souls? Because the way that Demon's Souls levels play out is it's a level, and then once you reach the dead end, you fight the boss, you leave, and you go back to the hub. That could have been implemented in the same fashion here with Firelink Shrine, where Firelink Shrine is your hub, and you have these different areas that are attached to it, once you reach the bonfire at the end, you warp back to Firelink. It could have worked as a quasi-level select, but because the game tries to have this interconnectedness, that's something that I think a lot of players view as an evolution of the Demon's Souls formula. It's not a sentiment that I share, but I do think that the incorporation of that interconnected world is a very valuable and praiseworthy part of Dark Souls' design. However, why wasn't that same type of design implemented in the second half of the game? The second half regresses to having this sort of level select style where you can choose which level to tackle in any order that you like. However, it is very reliant on warping between bonfires, and it still wants to preserve that sense of interconnectedness, which is why you're able to warp to different bonfires, not just Firelink, but go all the way with it. Why can't I warp back to the Undead Parish, for example, and make use of that blacksmith services? This is very clearly an important NPC, and that's also a very important junction point similar to Firelink Shrine where different areas splinter off from it. I don't know why, particularly Undead Parish was not included in this original release of the game as a warpable bonfire. Even though I said I wasn't interested in lore, I'd be interested in seeing someone else justify the placement of these boars in this hallway, if there's some sort of lore justification that they can come up with, because as far as I'm concerned, this is yet another example of a long area. You've got these long hallways. The developers couldn't really think of anything interesting to do with this space, so let's just reuse a mini-boss from earlier in the game. I'm always questioning, why is this enemy here? What was the purpose of placing him here? And maybe in that instance, it's less about creating a cohesive world design, like we have to find some sort of justification for placing this enemy here, and instead it became something that played into level design where, forget the lore reason, we need to make an interesting challenge. What if we place an enemy that charges at you and he's in a narrow hallway? Wouldn't that create an interesting challenge? And I think it does. What you're not going to see here is the roughly 30 minutes I spent trying to get this skip to work. I don't like forced deaths in video games, and it's particularly annoying in this case because a lot of times forced deaths, you see this in RPGs, they happen in the early game, and it's a way to show a disparity of power level between you and it's typically the final boss or the main antagonist. You lose to the boss, and it's supposed to show how weak you are. That way when you fight the boss later on, it shows growth, it shows that you've obtained strength, you know now how to fight this enemy. This death doesn't have that same impact because after you die to Seath, you proceed through a little portion of the level and about 20 minutes later you confront him again, and you're not forced to die to him anymore. If this was implemented like how it was in Demon's Souls, where that dragon kills you at the end of the tutorial and you fight him later on in 3.3, that would be an interesting implementation of showing growth. That is something that Demon's Souls exhibited that type of game design much stronger than Dark Souls. Having this part of the game where the forced death and the proper boss fight, that time frame is very brief, doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And in terms of gameplay purposes, the death warps you to a different part of an environment. Why not just have that part of the environment be connected in a different way, maybe a teleporter? This is already a magical place, it wouldn't be so out of line to expect some sort of contraption that moves you between areas in the blink of an eye. Or maybe have a pit. Maybe you fall down a pit and it moves you to a different part of the level and you gotta work your way out of the pit. There are different ways to have that part where you want to move the player to an isolated portion of the environment without having it be tied to a forced death. The worst part about this encounter isn't even the fact that it's a scripted death, it's the curse buildup. And when I played this game last time, 2 years ago during my Soul Level 1 run, I had made the realization that curse buildup persists after death. How can the status buildup persist after I'm dead? Oh my god, yeah, I'm done with this game. I'm done with this game. How can I continue to get curse buildup once I'm dead? Why is that a thing? And that becomes an extreme annoyance, and it doesn't happen during this first confrontation, but I do get the curse to stick during the proper Seath boss fight. And it's incredibly annoying because it doesn't really make sense for the status buildup to persist after you've already taken that lethal hit. This is a pretty interesting way to reuse a stage in two different ways, which I like. I like reusing assets and presenting them from different perspectives. But the way that the game presents this stage is peculiar because it does it in the opposite way that I would have expected. What I would have expected from this type of design is heading down the staircase is the part that would be devoid of enemies, and then after you grab the key item and you try to make your way back the path that you came, now it's populated with enemies, and that presents the same stage in a different light. That is something that I think would have been the more traditional approach of handling this level. Instead, this is presented backwards, where you fight the enemies first, and then after you grab the key item and you make your way back to where you came from, it's empty. It makes it pretty uneventful. It makes it just this compulsory journey to head back to the top. I do think that there was a bit of a missed opportunity with this particular level because it is magic-centric, but there's not a whole lot of magic spellcasting going on here. These enemies fight in melee range. There are a couple of those channelers that can hit you from a distance, but just a couple. For the most part, those crystalline hollows fight in the same fashion as the non-crystalline version, where they're just wielding the same weapons. It's a sword, it's a bow. I think those little Cthulhu-esque tentacle abominations, if they were spellcasters, then that would help sell me on the atmosphere of this being a magically charged level a little more. But for the most part, like you see here, you're just fighting the same melee range enemies that you've been fighting for most of the game. I don't know if this is another part of the game where the developers were just pressed for time and they had to make do with the assets that they had. These are just reskinned hollows and they were reusing snake men and channelers. I guess you could argue that the channelers were designed for this area and their presence in other areas is just a way to add some extra enemy variety, but I wanted to see more long-range combat in this area, maybe some more enemies using spells. No one casts fire spells, very few enemies have projectiles outside of the bow. Like, why not give this enemy a staff and have him fire magic missiles at you instead of firing arrows? Functionally, it would be the same type of enemy, but it would have a flavor that feels more in line with this environment. And again, I'm sure the lore justification for these hollows being covered in crystals makes sense, but it really doesn't make for that interesting of an enemy type to fight in the context of this environment. No matter what the lore justification is, I think it would be more appropriate to be fighting wizards and spellcasters as opposed to the same types of enemies that I've been fighting for the rest of the game up to this point. This is a bit of level design that I really like, where you can modify the environment and it changes the location that you can go to. I wish this was a type of design that was employed more throughout this game and throughout the series. This type of puzzle-centric exploration is something that I find very entertaining, and it's why I like playing a lot of exploration platformers. I like playing a lot of 3D games, and I've started to enjoy playing the Zelda series more as an adult, more than I ever did as a kid. And it's because the way the dungeons work, they involve a lot of interactivity. You press switches, you move parts of the environment around. That's a type of level design that I really enjoy. And this is a subject that I cover in more detail in a video that I made a few months ago where I talked about the different types of map design in video games. But to give a summarized version of that, my preferred style of map is one that has different approaches to how you choose to proceed through it. It doesn't have this linear, compulsory method that you must follow every time. For example, in Duke's Archives, you have that unintentional Seath skip, and though I don't like how it's employed and it's very clearly a level design oversight, I really like that FromSoft didn't bother patching it out. And it is difficult to pull off, and the reward is pretty significant. You get to skip over that forced death, and you get to skip over a pretty significant chunk of the stage. I also really like how, I think it's a crossbow named Evelyn, which is a pretty good weapon, and to obtain it, you need to fall off the shifting staircase. I believe while it's in motion, you need to fall on top of a bookshelf. It's not something that you can easily find, that item. It's something that is rewarded through a keen observation of the environment. That's what I'm talking about, where I like where video games have secrets tucked in their environments and they reward skilled gameplay. You can't get certain items unless you meet a certain level of competence in navigation, and you can't proceed through certain shortcuts unless you achieve a certain mastery of the controls. I think that's a reason why platformers are so popular for speedrunning. It's because more than any other genre, they afford you the opportunity to use secrets or to use difficult shortcuts depending on how skilled you are at movement. And that's what I think made the Metroid series so compelling for the longest time. So in the interest of disclosure, this is the part where I decide to give up on the Duke's Archive. I don't revisit this until the end of the game. This is the last major soul that I collect, is the one from fighting Seath. I do open up this shortcut and grab the Duke's Archive bonfire, but it doesn't wind up helping me because it doesn't register as a warpable bonfire shortcut. So at this point, I'm going to skip over the Crystal Caves and the confrontation with Seath, and I will revisit this after covering the other 3 major boss fights. The next boss that I tackle is going to be Sif, and on the subject of Sif, I do not cover the Artorias of the Abyss DLC in this commentary, for 2 reasons. Number 1 is I'm playing the emulated version of this game, and I didn't bother to seek the DLC file. That's a bad excuse. The real reason is that I don't really enjoy the DLC for this game. Sacrilege, I'm sure, but I think that this is already a perfectly acceptable length for a game campaign. I don't want to add extra playtime to it. I'm perfectly satisfied with the content on offer in the base game. I know a lot of players, whenever they have something good, they clamor for more of it. I'm not one of those players. I don't really ever ask for sequels or more DLC. The only thing that I really ask for is a base game that can hold its own, and I think Dark Souls holds its own perfectly well as is. In fact, I would rather it end in Orlando, but even so, this second half of the game creates enough of a playtime for me to be more than satisfied. Like I said, I'm not an enormous Dark Souls fan, and I'm not even really sure why I decided to do running commentary for this game when I have plenty of other games that I really enjoy that would probably be more suitable for this sort of commentary video. I guess what makes Dark Souls the easy target for me to want to do a commentary on is I have a lot of positives and negatives to share about the game, and having that balance is what makes for, at least for me, an interesting discussion where in one breath I can praise a part of game design and in the very next breath I can criticize it. In regards to critique in general, not just video games, but I think all entertainment, a lot of people view it as negative. Critiques are a negative thing, it's a negative process, but I don't really view critique in that way. The thing is, being critically negative, at least for me, I won't speak for anyone else, but being critically negative is far easier than being critically positive. Finding something that you like about a video game and expanding upon why you like it is extremely difficult. But if you find something that you dislike, oftentimes people, and again, I'm not speaking for anyone, but just from what I've seen, it certainly seems easier for people to be very eloquent in their explanation as to why they dislike something. You may not like a boss, here's why I don't like it. It's too hard, it's too long, the environment is bad, the camera's bad, the mechanics don't make sense. But what if you're praising a boss fight? Oftentimes it's like, the mechanics are good, but that's very vague. What does that mean, the mechanics are good? The boss fight is fun. Even the word fun itself, though I am inclined to use it very often, I don't want to use it. It's just something that I say naturally, because I understand what I view as fun, but relaying what my vision of fun is to an audience is a lot more difficult. And that's where I think being critically positive about something can be very beneficial, because a lot of players want to understand why you find something good, why you find something fun. But trying to find a way to explain why you enjoy something is very difficult if you're not used to it. And I think that's part of the reason why I've made so many negative videos in the past, and why I'm trying to make a push for a few more positive ones in my video lineup, is because I want to challenge myself to praise the games that I like and explain why I like them. And it's something that's very difficult to do, and I don't know if I'll ever achieve mastery of that. I think at some point I'm just gonna have to boil my explanation down to, it's good, I like it, it's fun. And it's very simple and it's very narrow-minded. Like, you can just say that about anything. Where are you gonna provide the substance that people can latch onto and help make a more informed judgment as to why something is good? That is the part of critical discussion that I really want to lean more into as I make more videos. Difficult though it may be, there's really no way to become better at it without trying. And I think subconsciously that's why I decided to talk about Dark Souls. In my mind, if I'm already analyzing something through a critical lens, and I'm talking about the negative parts of it, I already have that critical mindset, so all I need to do is change some settings in my brain, and now I'm talking about the positive parts. It all comes from having that mental framework already established. Heading into the Demon Ruins here, I don't mind this area as much as I really should, and I'll get to why in a minute, but most of this is wide, flat, open, and optional, and if you choose to move towards the west, you just fight copy-paste Asylum demons, and if you move towards the northeast, you fight copy-paste Capra demons. It's another case of reusing existing bosses as downgraded normal enemies, which I don't like. I also don't like this part where it's just wide open flat terrain with nothing really interesting going on, and I don't know why all of the enemies are clustered here. Yeah, it's a little bit more challenging because to the right you can roll off the cliff to your death, but I would have liked to see a more even distribution of enemies leading up to this part rather than having this congested choke point right here. So strictly speaking, from a level design perspective, I don't think that this is a great area, and the same can be applied to Lost Izalith. But it's really not so much the Demon Ruins that I want to single out as a point of praise so much as it is this part. Number one, I really like the framing of this heading down the staircase and then heading up into the boss arena. But in particular, I really like that this is a part of the game where you fight two bosses back to back. It feels like a quasi-boss rush with the amount of boss density that is in this part, where you can fight Ceaseless Discharge and then about a minute and a half later you can make your way to the Demon Fire Sage, and then about 30 seconds after that it's the Demon Centipede, and then you run through Lost Izalith in about 2-3 minutes and you fight the Bed of Chaos. So that's 4 bosses that can be fought in a span of about 10 minutes. You really don't have that kind of boss density anywhere else in the game, and when you consider one of the highlights of the Dark Souls playthrough is fighting the bosses, that is a part of the game that I have to single out as a point of praise. I would have liked to see a higher boss density in other areas, maybe even in Anor Londo. I really think Anor Londo could have stood to have another boss fight, not just Ornstein and Smo. Maybe having that Gwendolyn fight be compulsory and not hidden through this secret optional area would have been more beneficial to making that a more dangerous place. You have that iconic introductory scene for Anor Londo. It looks like this immense area where the difficulty is going to ratchet up, and then it's just a whole lot of nothing for that first half, and the second half is capped off with just one boss. Here, this doesn't look like quite the same type of intimidating area, and yet it's flush with bosses. This is almost a good boss fight, and I can see what FromSoft was going for here with having this be another boss where you need to be wary of the environment because you can step into the lava and take lethal damage. But what really holds it back is you don't get the item needed to help you traverse this arena unless you cut off the tail mid-fight and then go through the cumbersome process of equipping the ring while also making sure that you don't die to the boss's attacks. That's the only time where you'll be able to have safe access to move to the little islands that pepper this arena. Without that ring, you don't have the opportunity to move from island to island to avoid the boss's attack. Instead, you're forced to stand here on this little safe spot by the entryway. And that makes it another one of these boss fights where you're fighting the camera the entire time because it's zoomed in way too close and you're fighting an enormous enemy and it's very difficult to see what you're attacking. What would have made this a more interesting fight without having to deal with that cumbersome process of equipping an item is just if the lava level lowered and raised periodically throughout the fight. And that would have been a way to control the boss's movement and to maneuver him around the battlefield. The way that I dealt with this boss is I obtained the ring mid-fight, which I wasn't expecting, but I didn't feel compelled to open my menu and equip it because I was already dealing with the boss just fine. I didn't really feel compelled to venture out into the lava to move him around. But maybe if a player died and then he equipped that ring, that repeat attempt when you have that second chance to fight the boss, then you can make better use of the environment. You can move him around. You won't mind stepping into the lava because you take very little damage. Speaking of, in this unpatched version, I think you take a little bit less damage from the lava while wearing the orange charred ring. But why couldn't you have that freedom to move around the arena in the lava without having to die first? And I guess the easy solution would be to just give you the ring before you even confront the boss and equip it beforehand. That way you won't have to die and you won't have to do any sort of menu gymnastics, and you'll still be able to move the boss around the environment. Although in that situation, you're not going to be taking a whole lot of damage from the lava anyway, so you still don't have that interesting type of level design during the boss fight, because if the lava poses no threat with the ring equipped, then it ceases to be an interesting environment. The only thing that makes it interesting is the fact that you can take lethal damage from the lava, and with the ring equipped, you get rid of that challenge. So I think that boss has some missed potential. As much fun as it is to be a hipster and a contrarian, you won't see me praising this level. For one, it's just, there's not a whole lot going on here. The really only interesting bit of level design is the hidden bonfire, which really only exists to help facilitate that online component once again, where I would complain about this bonfire being hidden because it's an important checkpoint in the run back to the boss, but this was a game that was meant to be played online, and when you play online, you're going to see a soapstone sign here, 100% guaranteed, that tells you bonfire ahead. So I can't be too much of a complainer on that front. The only thing that's keeping Lost Izalith from being a tolerable area as opposed to an annoying one is this first half with the lava lake. I understand that time constraints had to have played a major role in this game's development, but if that's the case, rather than including this area just because it was designed, I would prefer if they just cut it out. At least in this part of Lost Izalith, the level design feels a little bit more interesting. You're not just running around an enormous lava lake taking damage, and the enemy placement makes a lot more sense. It doesn't feel like copy-pasting enormous enemies just for the sake of challenge. Yeah, these are not really any threat to run past, but at least it feels like a more cohesive level here, whereas it straight up feels unfinished in that initial part of Lost Izalith. Here is something that really shouldn't come as a surprise, considering I frequently praise the bosses in Demon Souls. I happen to like the bit of chaos. I think that this is a memorable boss fight, and you could argue that a boss fight can be memorable for good or bad reasons, but I would argue that memorable is memorable. I happen to like this boss because it's so different from the rest. Is it challenging? Absolutely not. But again, challenge is not what I'm seeking. I'm seeking an interesting encounter. And I guess you could argue that there's really nothing interesting about moving left and right and striking these pustules to kill the boss, but that's not really the point of this encounter. The point is the level itself. You can see that it crumbles. This is where the challenge comes from. It's not falling into the abyss. So in a sense, it's not so much a combat encounter so much as it is a movement encounter, which ties into that point that I made probably 2 hours ago at this point, where I would like to see action games focus more on creating interesting movement challenges. And that's why I've been more drawn towards platformers in recent years, because when you want to talk about video games having interesting level design and making good use of movement, there's no better genre than the platformer. The platformers are the ones that understand that the level design is everything, not so much the boss encounters. Whereas it feels like FromSoft is placing all of their focus in the combat and not as much focus in the level design. Although I will be fair, you do still see some vestigial remnants of that Demon Souls DNA leaking through in some of the later FromSoft games. For example, Dark Souls 3 has that one dragon fight where you need to ascend this ruined zone so you can do a plunging attack on the dragon, and I don't think that that's a very popular fight. And if you were to judge it strictly in terms of the combat encounter, yeah, it's probably the worst fight in the game. But I also have a soft spot for it for the same reason why I have a soft spot for the Bed of Chaos, because when viewed in the context of that entire game's repertoire of bosses, it stands out. And Dark Souls 3 actually has a few bosses that try to do different things. There's also that skeleton where you need to break apart its golden glowing cuffs in order to deal damage to it. And for some players, these are going to be absolutely the worst fights in the game because the only thing they want to do is flex their combat prowess. But as someone that appreciates the depth of an action game beyond just swinging a sword, I appreciate these fights. I like when you're challenged in terms of movement, in terms of puzzle solving, in terms of situational awareness. There are other parts of game design that can be tested even in an action game that don't revolve around strictly combat. And I like that FromSoft, though they don't do it that often, it's still something that they have in the back of their mind when it comes to designing bosses. The Catacombs is another standout level, and it's due entirely to its enemy design. And I think anyone that's spent any significant amount of time playing Dark Souls and can share praise for it, I think at the top of their list of positives would be the enemy design of this game. It is absolutely one of the strongest parts, and it has to be, because though the combat system in this game isn't really remarkable, that isn't something that really matters in an action game, and that may be something that people will be inclined to disagree with. But to at least prove the point in my eyes, I really enjoy the first Ys game, and that doesn't even have an attack button. That game, all of the combat is handled through the bump system, where running into an enemy deals damage to them. You don't have any attacks in that game. You don't have any combos. Your attacks don't have different properties based on different weapons that you equip. Every single time you attack an enemy, it comes from attacking them offset. If you attack them directly, you take damage. So the challenge of that game comes from studying how to approach the enemies. Some of them you can just head slightly offset, some of them you need to head around and attack from the back. There are different ways that you can create interesting challenges, even in a game that has no attack buttons. And it's still a fantastic action game in my eyes. Dark Souls has a lot more going on in its combat system. It is more mechanically complex than Ys 1, but for the same reason I enjoy this game not for its combat system, but for the depth of the enemy design. So for example, in the Catacombs, there are 3 primary enemies here. The first are these skeletons. What makes these skeletons stand out is they're a lot more mobile than some of the other enemies you've fought so far. These roll towards you, and that makes them a more aggressive type of enemy. And they also swarm you in groups. It's very rare to be attacked by just a single skeleton. But I think what holds this level back just a little bit is that it doesn't really feel like it's balanced for the part of the game where you're required to enter it. And that's a shame because at the point that I've decided to come to the Catacombs where I need to be here, all of these enemies are dying in 1 or 2 hits, and that can be counteracted to a small extent because the skeletons revive. You're supposed to seek out the black cloaked mages that carry lanterns, and that's the only way to put a permanent end to these enemies, but it doesn't feel like the pressure is applied too strongly here. I don't really feel that compelled to seek out these mage-like enemies because it's easy to skip a huge chunk of the Catacombs, and I think that's probably the one thing working against it more than anything. But by skipping through this level, you skip over that unique part where you have these unkillable, persistent threat of enemies chasing after you the entire time. And it also, because they're unkillable, it plays into that whole pressure aspect where there's this maze-like design to this area. All these platforms are narrow, there are different bridges that you need to flip switches so you can create paths back and forth through that abyss. There are these walls that you can destroy, there's black pits down below. It's very easy to get lost here, and that's supposed to make it more challenging to find the mage enemies that you have to kill to finally put an end to the respawning skeletons. But you can ignore that whole aspect of the level if you can just skip over it with that shortcut. And another cool enemy design can be found at the bottom of this abyss where you have those wheel skeletons. They put the pressure on you even more than these rolling bipedal skeletons here up top. Those rolling skeletons, because there's no hit recovery in this game, they can put that pressure on you where once they hit you, they can continuously deal damage. And that's a pretty understated part of Dark Souls enemy design, and I think that's what lends to some of its challenge, is there's no invulnerability frames to taking damage. Enemies can stunlock you. If you have very little poise and you come into an enemy that can hit you multiple times in succession, if they stun you with that first hit, for example in the Gwyn fight, if Gwyn breaks your poise with his 3 or 4 hit combo, you die from full health. Another thing that I really like about the Catacombs is how much it resembles the architecture and atmosphere of the Kingsfield series. And it's well known at this point that Demon's Souls and Dark Souls can be considered spiritual successors to Kingsfield, but I think if you navigated through the Catacombs in first person, you could just consider this to be a straight up sequel to Kingsfield. And after 17 years now worth of Souls games being produced from FromSoft, I would like to see them not so much make a sequel to Kingsfield, rather something that is more inspired by Kingsfield. Maybe make another first-person exploration-focused game as opposed to these very combat-dominated Souls games that have become extremely popular. And I know that's something that a lot of players may be against. They know what FromSoft is good at. They're good at making these style of games like Dark Souls. And if all they did was make iterations of Dark Souls for the next 50 years, I'm sure there are countless players that would be more than satisfied. But as someone that doesn't really seek out sequels and remakes, someone that values new ideas, I think From Software has some untapped potential where they could make some of the best exploration and atmospherically rich games out there, but they're kind of stuck in this routine of making these like crowd-pleasing action games. And I love action RPGs as much as the next guy, it's one of my favorite genres, but again, as I grow older, I'm starting to get fatigued by the repetition here. A lot of the things that FromSoft did with Dark Souls that felt novel at the time have become worn tropes at this point. I'd like to see some more unique titles from them as they did in the early 2000s. They made the Otogi duology. They also made the Lost Kingdoms duology on the GameCube. And they've made a whole array of mech games that people have never heard of. They've heard of Armored Core, but half of FromSoft's library consists of a lot of obscure mech games. I would like to see them maybe spend more time experimenting and trying out new genres and new games, as opposed to just making another 2 decades worth of Souls clones. Coming into Tomb of the Giants here, going through this zone without the darkness would be like riding Space Mountain with the lights on. It would be pretty boring, and having most of the area cloaked in darkness turns something mundane into something pretty special. In this 1.0 version, the Catacomb Necromancers, they don't drop lanterns, so there was a higher chance of coming into this zone unprepared. You're hinted here at the start to use Prism Stones to light the way as sort of a last-ditch resort, which is what I used in my first playthrough. Again, teaching a player how to play through observation instead of overt tutorials. And you can compare this to the yellow paint epidemic that we're seeing in modern games, where the issue with game design is how do we guide players through environments. Sometimes we make very complex environments and it's not immediately obvious which path the player should be taking. We want to offer some guidance, that way they don't get frustrated with getting lost. How do we do that? And the easy solution, sort of the catch-all solution that developers have turned to, is to paint parts of the environment yellow because it's a high contrast color, and players use that as a sort of beacon to guide them through the environment. And I think the reason why players don't complain about excessive guidance in Dark Souls is because the methods that FromSoft took to guide players through these levels feels more organic. It doesn't feel forced. For example, in Blighttown I mentioned that you have those torches to light up your path, and in the Crystal Cave you have snowflakes that land on these invisible platforms, and that's supposed to signal you on where those platforms are and how you can get through that area. And I think the most interesting implementation of guidance can be found with an audio cue if you play online. You can hear players ring the Undead Parish Bell of Awakening, and you hear it in the distance in Undead Burg, and you already know if you spoke to that NPC you're supposed to ring that bell, so then it becomes an act of follow the sound. That's the only implementation of an audio cue used as guidance, I think, in this game. I'm sure players will find other examples and correct me if I'm wrong, but that is a very obvious standout example, but it only works if you play online. And again, that's supposed to be another part where the online experience helps to elevate your playthrough. So Dark Souls takes some pretty interesting ways to guide a player through each level, but it doesn't feel overt like yellow paint. It doesn't feel belittling. And most importantly, it doesn't feel lazy. And I think that's why yellow paint is such an easy target. It's because it feels lazy. It feels stock. It doesn't look like a natural part of these environments. When Ghost of Tsushima used wind to guide you to your objective, you brushed your finger on the touchpad, that was singled out as a point of praise because it felt more immersive. The wind blew the grass and the leaves of the trees, and that was supposed to tell you which direction you're supposed to follow. It didn't have this obvious stick out like a sore thumb yellow paint tainting the landscape. I don't think that this is viewed in most players' eyes as an issue of guidance, which is the issue that I take with it. Plenty of games guide players with map markers and hardly anyone complains about that. Except for me, but I complain about everything. But I think for most players, this is less of an issue about holding their hand, and more of an issue about artistic world design. For me, it's both artistically uninteresting and it takes away from exploration. If people want to point to Dark Souls as a point of inspiration, I wish they would be inspired by its approach to making each stage guide the player in more unique ways. It doesn't reuse ideas, it doesn't just plaster yellow paint everywhere. This is another level defined by lighting and enemy placement instead of its physical structure. Enemies were balanced for this environment. They don't have large aggro zones. Oftentimes, they don't get aggressive until you're right in front of their face. And the choice of enemy is appropriate. Stumbling into a tiny enemy in the dark wouldn't have the same impact as running into a skeleton 3 times your size. It's like a jump scare. So despite being a short and linear zone, the darkness makes it easy to go in circles. You get these sensations where, have I been here before? You get those moments. Not to say that linearity is bad, but in an exploration-centric game, this is a unique way to create a confusing layout instead of designing like a maze. In the Duke's Archive section, I mentioned that I'm starting to prefer exploration-focused games like Zelda, but that doesn't mean that I dislike games that aren't designed like Zelda. I love linear games, and I'm not advocating for every game to prioritize non-linear exploration. If a game wants to be exploration-focused, I just prefer if the devs design levels that allow for some creativity to approach most obstacles, rather than taking shortcuts to mimic that exploration. For example, games will have you pick up keys to open doors, but the path that you take to get that key and open that door is linear, with winding paths to give the illusion of exploration without actually having much of any. Zelda uses that same key and door approach, but oftentimes the small keys can open several doors in a dungeon, so you do have some choice in choosing the order to unlock the doors. The end result is the same once you're done, you can open every door eventually, but the path that you take along the way allows for some variance, and that variance is what fosters that explorative spirit. I've seen some pushback against the term player expression lately, usually in response to games with open-ended gameplay, but I'm not really sure why. Every interactive medium entails some degree of expression, and maybe it's that part, the degree, that's a point of concern. And I guess in that sense, I'd agree that giving a player 100 tools and telling him to use just one feels like a waste. Compromises have to be made to accommodate every one of those 100 tools. But expressive gameplay can still exist even in mechanically light games. In a shoot-'em-up, for example, playing for score as opposed to playing for survival can entail 2 widely different types of gameplay. Point blanking involves moving your ship to the top of the screen to catch enemies as they enter the frame, which is dangerous because it shortens the reaction time that you have to avoid bullets. But the reward comes from scoring. Some games reward higher score bonuses for point blanking. Some score you based on chaining enemies, which typically involves killing enemies within a certain time frame of each other. And one way to do that is to point blank. That is expressive gameplay, just through movement as opposed to utilizing tools like your Batman. And I think this medium is suitable for many different types of expression. Just comes down to balance, which is much easier said than done, of course. If you could snap your fingers and balance every game to your taste, how many people would come to hate video games? There's no one-size-fits-all solution, and the purpose of my videos isn't to advocate for a solution, it's just to share how I view games. For whatever that's worth, probably nothing, but at least I'm having fun making these. Nito is another pretty cool boss because it utilizes a mechanic that you were previously taught as you went through the catacombs, which is the skeletons don't permanently die until you kill the necromancer. In this boss arena, Nito is the necromancer, so your options are to either kill the boss and accept that you have these constantly spawning skeletons that are going to be attacking you, or find another solution to killing those skeletons. This is one of those things where I think some players think games can be too difficult because they don't realize that they have tools that can be used to strike an enemy's weakness and make something that was otherwise extremely frustrating to fight quite easy. But I like the way that Dark Souls implements weaknesses because it's not immediately obvious what you can use to kill these skeletons if the necromancer isn't around. You're supposed to make the connection that healing magic or anything that's holy can be used to put down undead because that's a well-known trope in the fantasy genre. And maybe if you're not well versed in the fantasy genre and you don't realize that that is a common trope similar to stabbing a vampire in the heart with a stake to kill him or shooting a werewolf with a silver bullet, you can view this as a frustrating enemy to fight. And I see players go online and complain not just about Dark Souls, but they'll go online and say, I don't know where to go, I'm lost, like in Metroid Dread. If Dark Souls was in the hands of a developer that doesn't respect the player's intelligence, I think the move would be to have either the character narrate out loud, skeletons, maybe holy magic will kill them, or they'll go an even lazier route and they'll tell you what to do with a little text objective on the screen like use holy magic to damage undead enemies. I really like that Dark Souls didn't take these shortcuts to remove that puzzle-solving aspect, and it's very likely that a player can finish this fight not knowing that you can kill these skeletons permanently without killing Nito. And if you do pull that off, I have to give you credit because you have a stronger sense of pride than me. I took the easy way out here. I have Zelda on the brain because I recently played through Twilight Princess for the first time, so I can't help but view New Londo Ruins as this game's version of the Water Temple. Although you only adjust the water level one time, and I kinda wish you had more interactions with that lever to raise and lower the water level, because it would have gotten more mileage out of this area. This is a pretty small zone in comparison to all of the other areas that we went to get the Lord Souls. There were usually two areas that were connected and they were pretty substantial. This one is just one zone and it's pretty brief. After you lower the water level, you can make a beeline for the boss area and it's not particularly difficult to find it. I think having that aspect where you have to adjust the water level constantly would have created a more maze-like structure to this area, and you would have went, maybe I need to lower the water level to get past this point, and make it more like a traditional Zelda water dungeon. And I'm sure that's an unpopular opinion because I don't think many players like water levels because of the tedium that comes from realizing, oh, I need to drain the water to get past this point. And maybe that's for the best. They didn't want to drag this game out any more than they needed to, especially because the back half of this game feels a little bit long in the tooth as is. But this is more of just for my own interpretation of this area. I think what would have made it more interesting is if they introduced a level of puzzle solving to it, because as it stands, it's pretty brief and there's not a whole lot going on here that I haven't already said about the other areas, mostly in terms of the enemy design. Just the only thing here is if you want to kill these enemies, you either need to be cursed or you need to use transient curse. And because they give you the transient curse right at the beginning of the area, there's really not a whole lot of challenge in finding a unique way to approach these enemies. You fight them as you would any other enemy, because the transient curse lasts for a pretty long time, and even if it ran out, the ghosts drop the item. What really would have made this a standout level is if you were forced to be cursed in order to kill these ghosts. So maybe having, in the same vein of raising and lowering the water level, instead of having that aspect to change the level, maybe you could have something where you cure and get cursed constantly back and forth. And Dark Souls 2 had a pretty interesting implementation of curse, because when you get cursed in that game, it doesn't kill you. That's probably one aspect where FromSoft realized that curse was too obnoxious of a status effect to keep in its same form in its sequels, so they altered how it worked. So I don't think Four Kings is that well designed of a boss fight, because the only interesting gimmick it has is that you can be swarmed by additional threats, but so long as you can push out as much damage as possible, that ceases to be a problem. And number two, it doesn't really play into the theming of the area. I just praise Nito for utilizing the same mechanic that was introduced in the Catacombs during the build-up to that fight, but there's nothing going on in the Four Kings encounter that was taught to you in the build-up to that boss. I guess an interesting thing to note would be, once you kill a king, its hitbox persists after death, and you can continue dealing damage to the total cumulative health bar. And I believe it's possible to cut this fight down to just a single king if you push your damage threshold to a high enough level. And the counterpoint to that would be, if you take too long in this fight, more than 4 kings will spawn, which is pretty amusing. And I have to imagine that the only reason why this is called 4 kings instead of just kings is for a lore reason. When this game came out, the popular strategy at the time was to stack full Havel's armor and use Iron Flesh because everyone was rolling Pyromancer anyhow, and Iron Flesh at the time gave you an immense defense bonus which was nerfed shortly after release. And I've employed that same strategy in the 15 years ever since. Just stack as much defense as possible and forsake blocking and dodging attacks in favor of dealing as much damage as you can. But you can't really use that same strategy in New Game Plus because I think the damage output of this boss far exceeds what you're capable of tanking. And that's something that gives New Game Plus value because you're forced to actually learn how to fight this boss. You can't cheese it on that second time around. Unfortunately, Dark Souls doesn't have the type of New Game Plus that I value, where enemy layouts are changed, or maybe item distribution is changed, or enemy behavior is altered to be more aggressive or more intelligent. And that's one aspect that I don't think FromSoft ever really cared that much to improve. I don't think the sequels to Dark Souls or Elden Ring or Sekiro have that type of higher level content that changes the enemy behavior or layout in a meaningful way. After that extended intermission, we returned to the Duke's Archive for my victory attempt against Seath. The Crystal Cave is a very confusing area for me, not in terms of layout, but in terms of its existence. I don't know why there's no bonfire at the start of this area or even partway through, and with how precarious its ledges are and how easy it is to fall to your death, it doesn't really incentivize me to go out of my way to grab these items, especially the ones tucked at the end of the invisible paths, because if I fall, I'm rewarded with running all the way back to this area. And I already discussed my thoughts on running through these empty zones, but you can see just how vacant Crystal Cave really is if you choose to not engage with the explorative aspect of looking for the secrets tucked at the end of the invisible paths. There's not a whole lot to this area. It's just a lot of long straightaways where nothing eventful happens. There's a moonlight butterfly down there, but instead of having that be a compulsory mini-boss, you have to go out of your way to confront it. And I'm especially not a fan of these clams that precede the boss door, because the first time you come here, once you enter the boss arena, there is no boss fog blocking your access. So once you trigger the boss, the clams are locked in with you. So the first attempt against Seath is the most challenging, mirroring some of the other bosses I talked about, most notably the Centipede Demon. But the difference with the Centipede Demon is you can always choose to not wear the orange charred ring to retain the challenge of that fight. You can never bring the clams back into the boss arena if you die in that first battle against Seath. I'm not sure if the extreme bloom exhibited here is a fault of the emulator, or if it's always been this way and I just don't remember it, or if that's maybe just a quirk of the unpatched version of Dark Souls. I can't say for sure. What I can say for sure is this is another example of the frustrating camera that's exhibited in fighting a giant boss in a tiny arena. A FromSoft specialty at this point. Can always come to rely on them having these types of boss encounters in their games, and it will never be an enjoyable type of fight. What I can say is at least this fight encourages you to use an unlocked camera during the encounter as opposed to many of the other fights, specifically because if you were to have a locked-on camera, it would severely limit your field of view and it would make it much more difficult to maneuver around the boss because of how stiff your movement would become. You strafe if you have a camera locked on to a target. This is a fight that would have benefited from having an isometric fixed camera that gives you an entire view of the battlefield. That way, when Seath decides to do his breath attack, you won't be caught off guard by an attack that is coming from off-screen, which is a concern that is present in a lot of action games that have controllable cameras, which is how do you give audio or visual cues to warn players of attacks that are coming off-screen? And Dark Souls doesn't have any of those cues. Maybe you could argue that it has audio cues. When Seath roars, he's going to do his breath attack, but you don't really know what the full extent of his attack would be. And something that I'm seeing in some modern games, like for example MMOs or in Trials of Mana, is you'll see these danger zones indicated on the floor. That way, if a boss decides to do an attack off screen, you'll know where it's going to land and you can orient yourself properly. Is that an elegant solution? I'm not sure. I can't say for certain if I like the implementation of danger zones on the floor, because then it becomes less of a fight of memorizing a boss's animations, and it instead becomes a fight of looking at the ground and making sure you're not standing where the attack is going to land. Which is much easier, but that's not really the part that I have an issue with. The part that I have an issue with is that's only a type of design that's incorporated because developers either don't want to have sufficient audio or visual cues from a boss's attack animations, or they have to contend with a camera angle that is very difficult to maneuver, so they want to provide you an opportunity to dodge attacks that would otherwise feel unfair. I turned off the HUD as I made my way through the kiln of the first flame, hoping to present a more cinematic and visually impressive fight against Gwyn without having the clutter of the HUD, but unfortunately I don't kill Gwyn on my first attempt. In fact, I don't kill him in 10 attempts, and rather than show you all of my repeated failure, I'll just show you my first attempt here, where I think I do a pretty decent job considering how abysmal I am at parrying, and then I'll show you my victory attempt. Unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot to say about this final zone. It doesn't have that same exploration-focused nature as the rest of the game does, and that is deliberate because this is your victory lap. It's instead supposed to be a build-up to this one specific boss fight. It's not about exploration, and it's not about the enemies along the way. In fact, it's very easy to run past all of them. It is all about this final fight. I'm not sure what the internet's consensus is on Gwyn, although I imagine they have to think that this is probably one of the stronger fights in the game, despite its lack of challenge if you choose to parry him. And that may be due to the lore, which is something that I don't have any interest in, as I explained earlier, and it also may be due to the iconic piano arrangement that's being played here. I can't speak to how well Gwyn is designed as a boss fight because I haven't had a lot of experience fighting him without parrying or without summoning for help. In fact, I can't think of any instance where I fought him on a one-on-one duel without parrying. Gwyn was probably meant to mirror the old King Allen fight at the end of Demon Souls, in the sense that they're both one-on-one sword-wielding humanoid opponents without any gimmicks involved. And Gwyn is a considerably easier fight if you choose to parry him, but if you choose to not take that approach, I think that he is a much more aggressive foe than old King Allen. Allen at least gives you some opportunity to create some safe space, whereas the only real safe opportunity you have to sneak in a hit against Gwyn if you choose not to parry is to avoid his grab and then punish him. Another thing to note is that in this 1.0 version, you only have 10 Estus flasks when you rest at the Lord Vessel as opposed to 20, and I can't remember if that was introduced in a patch or if that's new to the Remastered version. With only 10 flasks to work with and with an unupgraded weapon, I have to ensure that every flask is deliberate, and in my victory attempt I end with just a single flask left. Unfortunately, you cannot kindle the Lord Vessel in this game unless I'm mistaken, which I did try. At one point I reverted to human status and attempted to kindle the Lord Vessel to no avail. So unless you go to Firelink Shrine and maybe kindle that bonfire twice to get 20 flasks, you have to work with just 10 here. Unfortunately, I can't say that I'm terribly satisfied with how this video turned out. This was originally meant to be a discussion on why I enjoyed that first playthrough of Dark Souls so much, and why subsequent playthroughs didn't bring me anywhere near that same level of enjoyment, and why I didn't really care all that much for any of the FromSoft sequels released in the past 15 years. But I suppose I realized that I didn't have enough material to talk about that initial subject that I wanted to discuss, and that instead turned into this commentary and analysis of the different parts of Dark Souls design that interest me, for better and worse. And I think I've given the impression that I have a lot to say about Dark Souls that is praiseworthy, when the reality is Though I have a lot to say about this game that is positive, it should be viewed in the context of this game in isolation and in the time of its release. Because with how many games have since come to mimic From Software's design, especially in regards to Dark Souls, and not so much Demon Souls, I've come to sort of resent the existence of this game. Not so much for what it is, but for what it's done to the gaming landscape. So many games have taken inspiration from Dark Souls, and they've taken inspiration in ways that I don't find particularly appealing anymore. What made Dark Souls so appealing was that it was novel at the time of its release. Maybe not innovative, but certainly a breath of fresh air. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, I'm playing Mina the Hollower right now, and that game uses a healing system that is almost entirely copied from Bloodborne. In Bloodborne, the rally mechanic made sense. You were spilling the blood of your enemies to heal in the same way that you are consuming blood vials to heal. You're a hunter in that game, and blood has a prominent role in its storytelling. Mina the Hollower, because it is inspired by a game that has a thematically different approach to its systems, is using a mechanic that doesn't fit within the context of its world. Mina in her universe is a scientist, and the Hollower, meaning she's someone that digs underground. But the point is that she's not a hunter like the main character of Bloodborne is. Why do you have to attack enemies to increase the amount of recoverable health that then you can make a reality by consuming a vial? You can also collect roses to increase the amount of recoverable health that you can heal. So is the game saying that picking up flowers is an equivalent energy source to hitting enemies? It's not clear. Since Mina is a scientist, why is she not using something that is more scientifically themed to recover health? But if you have a more creative approach to healing, then you won't have all these reviewers and players saying that this game resembles Dark Souls and Bloodborne, and use that as a form of marketing. It's a selling point. This game is now a Souls-like. The only thing that the developers of Mina the Hollower have done to help justify having blood vials here is, instead of calling them blood vials, they're called plasma vials. That's all the effort that they took to help justify the inclusion here. And that is a sort of distilled version of my complaints that I have with developers taking inspiration from the mechanics of the Souls series. They're taking mechanics and they're incorporating them in anachronistic ways. They don't fit within the world that these developers are creating. They're instead copying something that they like that they saw in another game. Why does an enemy absorb your spark when you die to it in Mina the Hollower, and you then need to kill that enemy to recover that spark? Because that's what Bloodborne does. Is that the fault of From Software? Absolutely not. And I cannot fault them for having the systems that they have in this game, because they designed them deliberately to be distinct. Other developers are not taking that same ethos when they're designing their games. They're not trying to be distinct, they're trying to create a sense of familiarity. And the only reason that I can think of for wanting to design your game that way is for mass appeal. I've shared my true thoughts about Dark Souls here at the very end that most people won't reach, but for anyone that has made it this far, thank you. This is an extremely long video, and I can't imagine most people will have the patience to sit through most of it. This is probably not anywhere near as entertaining as it really ought to be, especially for a platform like YouTube, where videos live and die by entertaining people and not so much sharing personal insights. But I guess in that sense, I hope you got something out of this video that you don't get typically from most other videos. I will say, to cap things off here, to not expect another video like this in the future. This was a video of circumstance as opposed to me deliberately seeking to make something like this. I don't want to make videos that are an hour long, let alone 3+ hours like this one. So with that being said, hopefully you look forward to my Dark Souls 2 video coming out next week. Thank you for watching, everyone. Have a nice day.